Have you ever wondered why there are two different creation stories in the book of Genesis? In the first chapter, it says, God created man and woman together at the same time. But then in the second chapter, it tells a completely different story where Adam is created first, lives alone for a while, names all the animals, and only then does God create Eve from his rib. This contradiction has puzzled readers for thousands of years. But what if I told you that according to ancient Jewish legends, there's a hidden story here that explains everything? What if Eve wasn't actually the first woman? What if there was another wife before her, a woman so powerful and dangerous that her very name was whispered in fear for centuries? Her name was Lilith, and her story is one of the most fascinating and mysterious tales you've probably never heard in Sunday school or religious education. Today we're going on a journey that spans over 4,000 years, from the ancient temples of Babylon to medieval Jewish mysticism, uncovering how a wind demon from ancient Mesopotamia became Adam's rebellious first wife and eventually transformed into the queen of all demons. And here's what makes this even more intriguing. This isn't just some modern fantasy story or internet myth. We have actual ancient texts, archaeological artifacts, and thousands of years of written traditions that tell us about Lilith. We have magic bowls buried under ancient Jewish homes, amulets worn by pregnant women for protection, and mystical texts that describe her in terrifying detail. But before we dive into this incredible story, let me warn you about something. The internet is full of misinformation about Lilith. You'll find websites claiming she's mentioned throughout the Bible, which she's not. You'll see people saying ancient goddess statues are definitely pictures of her, which they probably aren't. You'll even find modern interpretations that have nothing to do with the historical sources. So what we're going to do today is different. We're going to look at the actual evidence, the real texts, and trace how this legend actually developed over time. And trust me, the real story is far more interesting than any modern fiction could be. Think about this for a moment. How does a minor demon mentioned in passing in ancient spell texts become one of the most feared figures in Jewish folklore? How does she go from being just another evil spirit to being Adam's equal, his first wife who dared to say no to him? And perhaps most mysteriously, why were Jewish families across the Middle East and Europe hanging amulets above their babies' cribs with 3 strange angelic names, believing this would protect their children from a vengeful first woman that most people today have never even heard of? The story begins in ancient Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, where the first cities were built and writing was invented. Picture yourself walking through the streets of ancient Babylon 3,000 years ago. The night is falling, and people are hurrying home, closing their doors tight and whispering protective spells. They're not afraid of thieves or wild animals. They're afraid of something that comes in the wind, something that slips through cracks in walls, something that visits men who sleep alone and women in childbirth. They call these beings the Lilu, the Lilitu, and the Ardat Lili, which roughly translates to male demons, female demons, and maiden demons of the storm. These weren't your typical monsters with fangs and claws, at least not always. They were seductive, beautiful even, but absolutely deadly. Ancient clay tablets tell us they were spirits who had died unmarried or childless, forever wandering the earth in frustration, attacking the living out of jealousy. Men would wake up exhausted, claiming a beautiful woman had visited them in the night. Women in childbirth would cry out that invisible hands were trying to steal their babies, and sometimes babies would simply stop breathing in the night, and the parents would know that the Lilitu had visited. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like typical ancient superstition, just primitive people trying to explain things they didn't understand, like sleep paralysis, nightmares, or sudden infant death. And you'd be partially right. But here's where it gets interesting. These beliefs didn't just disappear, they traveled. As merchants moved along trade routes, as empires conquered and were conquered, as people migrated and intermarried, these demon stories spread and evolved. The Babylonian Lilitu became the Hebrew Lilith. And that's when things get really interesting. Fast forward to around 600 BCE. The Jewish people have been exiled to Babylon after the destruction of their temple. They're living in the same cities where these demon traditions are thousands of years old. And when they're finally allowed to return home and rebuild, they carry some of these ideas with them. We see the first hint of this in the book of Isaiah, chapter 34, verse 14. The prophet is describing the desolation that will come to Israel's enemies, painting a picture of their land becoming a wasteland inhabited by wild creatures. And there, among the owls and goats and jackals, he mentions something else, something that doesn't quite fit with the regular animals. In Hebrew, he writes the word Lilith. Just once, that's it. One single mention in the entire Hebrew Bible. But that one word opens a doorway to centuries of legends, fears, and mysteries. Because while the Bible mentions her only once, the Jewish oral traditions that were developing alongside the written scriptures had much, much more to say about her. And this is where our detective story really begins. How do we go from one unclear mention in Isaiah to elaborate stories about Adam's first wife? What happened in those missing centuries? The answer lies in a combination of ancient magic, religious interpretation, and human psychology that's absolutely fascinating. You see, by the time of Jesus and the Second Temple period, Jewish beliefs about demons and spirits had become incredibly complex. We know this because of an amazing archaeological discovery in the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Hidden in caves for 2,000 years, these scrolls include texts that mention Lilith not as a single demon, but as a whole class of demons, plural, the Lilin. There are songs and incantations specifically designed to protect against them. But the real treasure trove of information comes from something even more personal and immediate. Magic bowls. Imagine you're a Jewish family living in Babylonia in the 5th century CE. Your wife is pregnant, and you're terrified. You've heard the stories. You know that Lilith especially hates pregnant women and newborn babies because she can never have children of her own. So what do? You go to a scribe who specializes in protective magic, and you commission a bowl. This isn't just any bowl. It's covered in spiraling text, written in Aramaic, the language Jesus spoke, and it contains powerful formulas to trap and bind Lilith and her demon sisters. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these bowls, and they tell us something incredible. By this time, Lilith isn't just a name or a vague demon. She has a full personality, a backstory, and specific angels who can control her. The bowls mention 3 angels by name: Sanoi, Sansanoi, and Samangelof. Remember these names because they're going to become incredibly important. These aren't biblical angels like Michael or Gabriel. They appear nowhere in the Bible. Yet Jewish families across Mesopotamia knew these names and believed these 3 angels had power over Lilith. Why? What story were they all referencing? This is where we encounter one of the most mysterious texts in Jewish literature, the Alphabet of Ben Sira, written sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries CE. This strange, often satirical book contains the first full story of Lilith as Adam's first wife. And what a story it is. According to this text, when God created Adam, he also created a woman from the same earth at the same time as Adam's equal. Her name was Lilith. But almost immediately, there was trouble in paradise, and it wasn't about eating any forbidden fruit. The conflict was about power, about equality, about who would be on top, quite literally. When Adam wanted to lie with his wife, he expected her to lie beneath him. But Lilith refused. She said, and I'm paraphrasing from the original text here, "Why should I lie beneath you? We were both created from the same earth. We are equals." Adam wouldn't accept this. He insisted on being superior. So Lilith did something extraordinary and terrifying. She spoke the ineffable name of God, the secret name that gave her incredible power, and she flew away from the Garden of Eden. Think about what this means. Before Eve, before the snake, before the apple, there was already rebellion in paradise. And it wasn't about disobeying God's commands. It was about a woman refusing to be subordinate to a man. No wonder this story was controversial. No wonder it was whispered rather than proclaimed. And no wonder it captured imaginations for over 1,000 years. When Adam complained to God that his wife had left him, God sent those three angels we mentioned earlier to bring her back. They found Lilith by the Red Sea, a place that in Jewish tradition is associated with demons and chaos. The angels delivered God's ultimatum: return to Adam or face the consequences. But Lilith refused. She would rather accept a terrible curse than submit to being Adam's subordinate. The curse? 100 of her demon children would die every single day for all eternity. Imagine that. A mother watching 100 of her children die every day forever. But still, she wouldn't go back. In her rage and grief, Lilith swore revenge. She would attack human women in childbirth. She would strangle newborn babies in their cribs. She would seduce men in their sleep and use their seed to create more demon children to replace the ones she lost. But, and this is crucial, she also made a deal with the three angels. If she saw their names or images on an amulet, she would not harm that child. She was bound by this oath. This story explained so much for medieval Jewish communities. It explained why babies sometimes died for no apparent reason. It explained why women died in childbirth. It explained nocturnal emissions and erotic dreams. And most importantly, it gave them a way to fight back. If you knew the names of the three angels, if you had the right amulet, you could protect your family from Lilith's revenge. But the story doesn't end there. As we move into the medieval period, Lilith's legend grows even more elaborate. The Jewish mystical tradition known as Kabbalah transforms her from a bitter, vengeful first wife into something even more cosmic and terrifying: the Queen of the Demons, the Bride of Samael, who is the Jewish version of Satan, the dark mirror of the divine feminine. In these texts, Lilith isn't just Adam's rejected first wife. She's a fundamental force of evil in the universe, the female aspect of the cosmic forces of darkness. The Zohar, the most important book of Jewish mysticism, written in 13th century Spain, describes multiple Liliths, including the Great Lilith and the Lesser Lilith. It tells of her palace in the depths of the abyss, of her thousands of demon servants, of her eternal war against humanity. According to these texts, every time a man has an erotic dream or an involuntary emission, Lilith is there, stealing his seed to create more demons. Every Friday night when Jewish husbands and wives come together, Lilith watches jealously from the shadows, waiting for any opportunity to interfere. And yet, despite all this terror and power attributed to her, medieval Jewish families had their protections. Archaeological evidence shows us hundreds of amulets from across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, all with remarkably similar designs. They show Lilith bound in chains, surrounded by the names of the three angels, along with protective prayers and biblical verses. Sometimes she's depicted as a woman with long, wild hair and wings. Sometimes she's shown with bird feet or snake features, but always she's contained, controlled, bound by the power of those angelic names. What's fascinating is how widespread these beliefs were. We're not talking about some fringe superstition. These amulets have been found in the homes of rabbis and scholars, in wealthy merchants' houses and poor laborers' dwellings. From Yemen to Poland, from Morocco to Iran, Jewish communities knew about Lilith and took precautions against her. Pregnant women would hang amulets around their necks. Newborn babies would have them placed in their cribs. Boys would be especially protected until their circumcision on the 8th day, after which they were considered safe from her attacks. The tradition was so embedded in Jewish culture that even rationalist rabbis who didn't believe in demons would sometimes permit these amulets, reasoning that if it comforted anxious mothers and couldn't do any harm, why forbid it? Others fought against these practices, calling them superstition and foolishness. But the people kept their amulets anyway. The fear of Lilith was stronger than rabbinical disapproval. So how did all of this happen? How did wind demons from ancient Mesopotamia become Adam's first wife, and then transform into the queen of all demons? Over the next sections, we're going to trace this evolution step by step, looking at the actual texts, the real archaeological evidence, and the historical contexts that shaped this legend. We'll explore ancient Babylonian incantations that are 4,000 years old. We'll examine the magic bowls with their spiraling protective texts. We'll read the exact words of the Talmudic rabbis as they discussed Lilith's nature. We'll dive into the alphabet of Ben Sirah to see how the first wife story actually unfolds. And we'll venture into the mystical world of the Kabbalah, where Lilith becomes a cosmic force of darkness. But more than just telling you what these texts say, we're going to explore why these stories resonated so powerfully. What deep human fears and anxieties did Lilith represent? Why did the story of a woman who refused to be subordinate spread so widely in patriarchal societies? How did communities use these legends to explain the inexplicable tragedies of infant mortality and maternal death? And perhaps most intriguingly, what does it mean that the demon they feared most was not a monster or a beast, but a woman who said no to Adam and to God himself? As we go through this journey, I want you to remember that we're not just talking about ancient superstitions or outdated beliefs. These stories shaped real people's lives for thousands of years. Mothers sang lullabies mentioning Lilith to their babies. Families spent precious money on protective amulets. Communities developed elaborate rituals to keep her at bay. This wasn't just mythology. This was lived experience for countless generations. And here's something that might surprise you. While most people today have never heard of Lilith, or know her only from modern fiction and popular culture, her influence on Western culture has been enormous. The image of the succubus, the female demon who seduces men in their sleep, comes directly from Lilith traditions. The femme fatale of literature and film, beautiful but deadly, traces back to her. Even our modern word, lullaby, might come from the Lilith Abi songs that Jewish mothers sang, telling Lilith to go away and leave their babies alone. So as we dive deeper into this story, ask yourself, why does this ancient legend still fascinate us? What is it about Lilith, the woman who refused to submit, the mother who lost everything, the demon who became a queen, that continues to capture our imagination thousands of years later? The answers might surprise you, and they definitely won't be what you expected when we started talking about a simple contradiction in Genesis. Get ready, because we're about to explore one of the most complex, terrifying, and oddly sympathetic figures in all of mythology. We're going to meet Lilith in all her forms: wind demon, night terror, child killer, first wife, rejected woman, demon queen, and cosmic force. And by the end of this journey, you'll understand why, for thousands of years, people whispered her name in fear, wore amulets for protection, and told stories about the first woman who ever said no. Imagine walking through the ruins of ancient Babylon today, where only scattered bricks and foundation stones remain of what was once the greatest city on earth. Now imagine that same city 4,000 years ago, when its massive walls rose higher than any building in your town, when its hanging gardens were one of the wonders of the world, when priests climbed towering ziggurats to speak with the gods. In this city of marvels and magic, where people believed the boundary between the human world and the spirit world was dangerously thin, parents would huddle over their sick children in the middle of the night, whispering a strange incantation that archaeologists would find carved into clay tablets thousands of years later. The words they spoke were meant to drive away beings they called the Lilu, the Lilitu, and the Ardat Lili. These weren't gods to be worshipped or heroes to be celebrated. They were the demons that came in the darkness, and they were absolutely terrifying. But who exactly were these demons, and why were the people of ancient Mesopotamia so afraid of them? To understand this, we need to step back and look at how the Babylonians and Assyrians understood their world. You see, for them, the universe was populated with countless spirits, both good and evil. Every disease had a demon behind it. Every misfortune was caused by some malevolent force. And among the most feared of these forces were the wind and storm demons, beings who existed in the space between life and death, who could slip through walls like air and attack humans when they were most vulnerable. The word Lilu literally means something like wind or spirit in Akkadian, the language of ancient Babylon and Assyria. But these weren't just any winds. They were the hot, disease-bearing winds that blew in from the desert, the sudden gusts that could knock down buildings, the strange drafts that made people sick with fever. Have you ever been in a room where you suddenly felt a cold spot, or a weird draft that shouldn't be there? Now imagine you lived in a world where you believed that draft was actually a demon trying to possess you or steal your life force. That's the kind of fear we're talking about. The ancient texts describe 3 related types of these demons. First, there was the Lilu, a male demon who would possess women and make them sick or infertile. Then there was his female counterpart, the Lilith, who targeted men, visiting them in their sleep and leaving them exhausted and drained. And finally, there was the Ardat Lili, which translates to something like Maiden of the Lilu or Young Woman of the Storm. This last one is particularly interesting because she was described as a young woman who had died before marriage or childbirth, doomed to wander the earth as a vengeful spirit, attacking pregnant women and stealing babies out of jealousy for the life she never got to live. Now I know what you might be thinking. These just sound like explanations for sleep paralysis, nightmares, and sudden infant death syndrome, things that ancient people couldn't understand scientifically. And you're absolutely right. But here's what makes this fascinating. These weren't just vague fears or general anxieties. The Mesopotamians developed incredibly detailed descriptions of these demons, specific rituals to fight them, and an entire industry of professional exorcists and magic practitioners whose job was to protect people from them. We have thousands of clay tablets with incantations against the Lilu demons, and they're remarkably consistent across centuries and across different cities. One tablet from around 2000 BCE, currently sitting in the British Museum, contains an incantation that goes something like this: the Lilu demon, the Lilitu demon, the Ardat Lily, the hand of a god, the hand of a goddess, a fever that never leaves a man's body. They have seized this person. The tablet then goes on to describe an elaborate ritual involving specific herbs, prayers to protective gods, and actions the sick person must take to drive out the demon. What's remarkable is that we find almost identical incantations on tablets from different centuries and different cities, suggesting these beliefs were widespread and persistent. But the Lilu demons weren't just medical problems. They were sexual predators. The texts describe them as beings who couldn't have normal sexual relationships or bear children, so they attacked humans instead. The female Lilitu would visit men at night, appearing as a beautiful woman, seducing them in their dreams and stealing their sexual energy. Men would wake up exhausted, sometimes with physical evidence of nocturnal emissions, and know that they had been visited by a Lilitu. The male Lilu, meanwhile, would possess women, making them sick during pregnancy or causing miscarriages. The Ardat Lili was perhaps the most tragic, a young woman's ghost who had died a virgin, forever seeking the sexual fulfillment and children she was denied in life. What's particularly interesting is how specific the ancient texts are about when and how these demons attack. They strike at night, especially when people are alone. They target women during pregnancy and childbirth. They go after babies in their first few days of life. They're attracted to people who are ritually impure or who have broken taboos. And here's a detail that will become important later. They're described as having long, disheveled hair, wings like birds, and sometimes talons instead of feet. Sound familiar? These are exactly the features that will later be attributed to Lilith in Jewish texts written 2,000 years later. The Mesopotamians didn't just fear these demons. They had an entire system for fighting them. Professional exorcists called a shipu would be called to homes where someone was believed to be possessed or attacked by a Lilu demon. These weren't just random shamans or faith healers. They were educated professionals who had studied for years, memorizing hundreds of incantations, learning the names and characteristics of different demons, and mastering the rituals needed to drive them away. Think of them as a combination of doctor, psychiatrist, and spiritual warrior, all rolled into one. The rituals these exorcists performed were elaborate and specific. They might create a clay or dough figure representing the demon, perform rituals to trap the spirit in the figure, and then destroy it. They would draw magic circles around the sick person's bed. They would burn specific herbs that the demons supposedly hated. They would recite incantations that had been passed down for generations, words that were believed to have power over the spirit world. And perhaps most importantly, they would invoke the names of more powerful gods and protective spirits to drive away the demons. One particularly fascinating aspect of these anti-Lilu rituals is how they dealt with the sexual nature of these demons. If a man was believed to be visited by a Lilitu, the exorcist might perform a ritual marriage between the demon and a clay figure, then destroy the figure to kill the demon bride. If a woman was possessed by a Lilu, they might create protective amulets with images of the god Pazuzu, who, despite being a demon himself, was believed to protect pregnant women and children from other evil spirits. Yes, that's the same Pazuzu from the Exorcist movie, though Hollywood got pretty much everything else wrong about him. Now, here's where things get really interesting for our story about Lilith. Around 1800 BCE, someone in southern Iraq created a clay plaque that would later become one of the most debated artifacts in the study of ancient demons. It's called the Burney Relief, though you might also see it called the Queen of the Night Relief. It shows a naked woman with wings, talons for feet, and owls and lions as her companions. She's wearing a horned headdress that indicates divinity, and she's holding symbols of justice and rulership. For decades, scholars argued about who this figure represents. Some said it was the goddess Ishtar. Others argued for Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. But a significant number of scholars suggested this might be an image of a Lilitu demon, perhaps even the prototype for what would later become Lilith. The debate over this relief tells us something important about how these ancient demons were understood. They weren't always portrayed as hideous monsters. They could be beautiful, even divine-looking. They had power and authority. They were dangerous not because they were obviously evil, but because they could seduce and deceive. The woman on the Burney relief is beautiful, powerful, and terrifying all at once. She stands on lions, showing her dominance over even the king of beasts. She's accompanied by owls, birds associated with night and death. And those talons and wings, they mark her as not quite human, not quite of this world. But wait, you might ask, how do we get from these Mesopotamian demons to the Jewish Lilith? The connection isn't as mysterious as you might think. Remember, the Jewish people didn't develop in isolation. Abraham, the patriarch of the Jewish people, supposedly came from Ur, a Mesopotamian city. Later, the entire Jewish nation would spend decades in exile in Babylon, living right where these demon traditions were strongest. They would have heard the stories, seen the rituals, maybe even employed Babylonian exorcists when their own children got sick. We can actually trace linguistic connections between the Mesopotamian demons and later Jewish traditions. The Akkadian word Lilitu becomes the Hebrew Lilith. The characteristics stay remarkably consistent. A female demon who attacks pregnant women and babies, who seduces men in their sleep, who has wings and bird-like features, who is associated with the night and the wind. Even some of the protective rituals are similar. Just as the Babylonians used amulets and incantations against the Lilitu, Jews would later use amulets and prayers against Lilith. There's a clay tablet from around 600 BCE, right around the time of the Jewish exile in Babylon, that contains an incantation against the Lilitu that's particularly interesting. It describes her as the strange woman who has no husband, who has no child, whose husband has never undone her garment, whose virgin girdle has never been loosened. This image of a perpetually virginal but sexually dangerous demon will show up again and again in later Jewish texts about Lilith. She's portrayed as someone caught between states, neither properly married nor properly virgin, neither fully woman nor fully demon, and this in-between status is what makes her dangerous. The Mesopotamians also had elaborate classification systems for their demons, and the Lilu family was just one small part of a vast demonic hierarchy. There were the Utuku, who were ghosts of the improperly buried. There were the Alu, who were formless demons that could envelope a person like a garment. There were the Galu, who dragged people to the underworld. And ruling over many of these demons was Lamashtu, a goddess-level demon who was particularly feared as a killer of babies and pregnant women. Some scholars argue that Lamashtu, even more than the Lilitu, might be the true ancestor of the later Lilith legends, especially the aspects about child killing. Lamashtu was described as having a lion's head, donkey's teeth, and eagle's talons. She would sneak into houses and steal babies, either killing them outright or replacing them with demon changelings. Pregnant women wore elaborate amulets depicting Lamashtu being driven away by the god Pazuzu. These amulets often included incantations like, "Get out, Lamashtu, daughter of Anu. Your approach is like a lion's, your appearance is horrible. Your face is that of an angry lion." Notice how even though she's monstrous, she's also divine, being called the daughter of Anu, the king of the gods. This mixing of the divine and demonic will be important when we get to how Lilith is portrayed in later Jewish mysticism. One of the most remarkable things about these Mesopotamian demon beliefs is how practical and specific they were. The texts don't just say demons are bad and scary. They give detailed descriptions of how to identify different types of possession or attack. If a person has a fever and sees a woman with disheveled hair in their dreams, that's a Lilith. If a pregnant woman has pain on her left side and dreams of birds, that might be Lamashtu. If a man wakes up exhausted with no memory of his dreams, but physical evidence of sexual activity, that's definitely a Lilith. These were not vague superstitions, but detailed diagnostic manuals that trained professionals used to identify and treat supernatural ailments. The incantations used against these demons are also fascinatingly specific. They often tell the story of the demon's origin, as if knowing their history gives power over them. One incantation against the Ardat Lili tells how she was once a young woman who died on her wedding night, never consummating her marriage, and was cursed to wander the earth seeking what she never had in life. Another describes how the Lilith was created from smoke and wind, which is why she can slip through any crack or opening. These origin stories aren't consistent. Different texts give different versions, but they all serve the same purpose: to name and define the demon. Because in ancient Mesopotamian magic, to know something's true name and nature was to have power over it. As we move forward in time, approaching the period when Jewish culture begins to emerge as distinct from other ancient Near Eastern cultures, we see these demon traditions spreading and evolving. The Assyrians, who conquered Babylon, adopted and adapted these beliefs. The Persians, who conquered the Assyrians, had their own demon traditions that mixed with the Mesopotamian ones. By the time we get to the period of the Jewish exile in Babylon, around 586 BCE, these demon beliefs had been developing and spreading for over 2,000 years. This is the cultural soup that the Jewish exiles found themselves in. They were living in Babylon, hearing these stories, seeing these rituals, maybe even participating in them. And when they were finally allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, they didn't leave all these ideas behind. How could they? If you had lived for decades in a place where everyone knew that certain demons attacked babies, wouldn't you take precautions to protect your own children, even if your religion technically said these Babylonian demons didn't exist? And this brings us to a crucial question that scholars still debate. When the prophet Isaiah, writing either just before or during this exile period, used the word Lilith in his prophecy about the desolation of Edom, was he drawing on these Mesopotamian demon traditions? Was his audience expected to know what a Lilith was, because they had been hearing about the Lilith for years in Babylon? Or was this a purely Hebrew word that just happened to sound similar to the Babylonian demon names? The answer to that question will take us into our next chapter, where we'll look at that single, mysterious mention of Lilith in the Hebrew Bible and try to understand what Isaiah was really saying. But before we move on, I want you to consider something. These Mesopotamian demon beliefs weren't just ancient superstitions that died out thousands of years ago. In some parts of Iraq and Iran, people still tell stories about wind demons that sound remarkably similar to the ancient Lilu. They still hang amulets to protect babies from night spirits. They still whisper protective prayers when they feel an unexpected draft in a closed room. These beliefs survived conquests by the Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, Mongols, and Ottomans. They survived the rise of Christianity and Islam. They survived into the modern era. That's not just cultural inertia. That's a set of beliefs that spoke to something deep and persistent in human experience. The fear of losing a child, the anxiety about pregnancy and childbirth, the confusion about sexual dreams and nocturnal emissions, the need to explain why terrible things happen to innocent people. These are universal human concerns, and the Lilith demons provided an explanation and, more importantly, a way to fight back. So when we trace Lilith's origins back to these Mesopotamian demons, we're not just doing academic archaeology. We're uncovering beliefs that shaped how millions of people understood life, death, sex, and parenthood for thousands of years. These weren't just stories told around campfires. They were explanations for real tragedies, real fears, and real experiences that people couldn't otherwise understand. And as we'll see in the next part of our story, when these ancient Mesopotamian traditions encountered Jewish monotheism and biblical interpretation, something entirely new would be created. A demon with a name, a personality, and eventually, a backstory that would make her one of the most fascinating figures in all of mythology. The wind demons of Babylon were about to become something much more than just night terrors and fever dreams. They were about to become Lilith, the first woman who said no to paradise itself. But first, we need to look at that one strange verse in Isaiah that started it all and ask ourselves, what exactly did the prophet see in his vision of desolation that made him invoke the name of an ancient Mesopotamian demon? In 1935, a mysterious clay plaque appeared on the London Antiquities Market, and it would become one of the most controversial artifacts in the study of ancient demons and goddesses. Nobody knew exactly where it came from, though dealers claimed it was found in southern Iraq. Nobody could agree on who it depicted, though everyone agreed she was terrifyingly beautiful. And nobody could have predicted that this 4,000-year-old piece of baked clay would become central to every discussion about what Lilith might have looked like in the ancient world. Today, it sits in the British Museum, known officially as the Queen of the Night Relief, though most people still call it by its older name, the Burney Relief, after the dealer who first brought it to scholarly attention. And the question that has haunted scholars for nearly a century remains unanswered. Are we looking at the face of Lilith herself? Let me paint you a picture of what this relief actually shows, because even if you've seen photos of it online, you probably haven't grasped just how striking and strange it really is. The plaque stands about 20 inches tall and is made of baked clay, originally painted in bright colors that we can still detect traces of today. The central figure is a naked woman, and she's absolutely mesmerizing. She stands completely frontal, staring directly at you with large eyes that seem to follow you around the room. Her body is that of a beautiful woman, with emphasized breasts and pubic region, clearly meant to highlight her sexuality. But that's where the human resemblance ends. From her shoulders spread two massive wings, layered like an eagle's but originally painted with alternating red and black feathers. Instead of human feet, she has the talons of a bird of prey, massive and sharp, gripping the backs of two lions who lie docile beneath her. Flanking her on either side are two owls, turned outward as if keeping watch. And on her head sits a horned crown, the type worn by Mesopotamian gods and goddesses, marking her as a divine or semi-divine being. In her raised hands, she holds the rod and ring of justice, symbols of divine authority in ancient Mesopotamia. She's beautiful, she's powerful, and she's absolutely not human. When this relief first came to scholarly attention, the initial reaction was excitement. Here was a major piece of Mesopotamian art, incredibly well preserved, showing a powerful female figure that didn't quite match any known goddess. Could this be the demon Lilith that Jewish texts would later describe? After all, the dating was right. Somewhere between 1800 and 1750 BCE, right in the old Babylonian period when we know the Lilith demons were feared and worshipped against. The iconography seemed to match too. A beautiful woman with wings and bird feet, associated with owls in the night. It was almost too perfect. But here's where things get complicated. And this is why I love this artifact so much. The more scholars studied it, the more they disagreed about who it actually depicted. You see, in ancient Mesopotamian art, Gods and demons weren't just drawn randomly. There were specific rules, specific symbols, specific ways of depicting different deities. It's like how in Christian art, you can identify saints by their specific symbols. Peter has keys, Catherine has a wheel, Sebastian has arrows. Mesopotamian art worked the same way. So scholars started comparing every detail of the Burney relief to what they knew about different goddesses and demons. The first major candidate was Ishtar, also known as Inanna, the goddess of love, beauty, sex, and war. The naked female form certainly fits with Ishtar's role as a goddess of sexuality. The lions beneath her feet are one of Ishtar's primary symbols. The rod and ring of justice appear in many depictions of Ishtar. But there are problems with this identification. Ishtar is almost never shown with bird feet. She's associated with doves, not owls, and while she's sometimes depicted with wings, they're usually folded, not spread in this dominant, almost threatening way. The second candidate was Ereshkigal, Ishtar's sister and the queen of the underworld. The owls would make sense for Ereshkigal, as owls are associated with death in the night. The downward-pointing posture of the figure's hands might indicate a connection to the underworld below. The overall mood of the piece, beautiful but unsettling, fits with a death goddess. But again, there are problems. Ereshkigal isn't usually shown naked. She doesn't typically stand on lions, and the rod and ring of justice aren't commonly associated with her. And then there was the third possibility, the one that captures our imagination most. Could this be a Lilith demon? Perhaps even the prototype for what would become Lilith. The bird feet certainly match descriptions of these demons. The wings fit perfectly. The owls, as night birds, align with the nocturnal nature of these spirits. The overt sexuality of the figure matches the seductive aspect of the Lilith. And perhaps most intriguingly, the fact that she's shown with divine symbols, but in a somewhat transgressive way. Naked and with monstrous features might indicate she's a demon pretending to divinity, exactly how later texts would describe Lilith. But before we get too excited about this possibility, let me share something that might disappoint you, but is crucial for understanding how we study ancient history. We don't actually know for certain that this relief depicts any specific mythological figure. It could be a goddess we haven't identified yet. It could be a unique piece representing a local deity or demon that didn't leave any other trace in the historical record. It could even be a composite figure, combining attributes of multiple deities for ritual or artistic purposes. The honest truth is, we may never know for certain who the Queen of the Night really is. What we can do, though, is look at what this relief tells us about how ancient Mesopotamians imagined powerful female supernatural beings. And this is where it gets really interesting for our story about Lilith. Whether or not this specific relief depicts a Lilith demon, it shows us that 4,000 years ago, people were already imagining female figures who combined beauty with terror, sexuality with danger, divinity with monstrosity. These weren't separate categories in the ancient mind. A being could be simultaneously attractive and deadly, divine and demonic, to be desired and to be feared. Think about what that means for a moment. We often imagine that ancient people had simple, straightforward beliefs, that their gods were good and their demons were bad. End of story. But this relief shows us something much more complex. Here's a figure holding symbols of divine justice while having the feet of a predator. She's naked and sexual, but also powerful and threatening. She controls lions, the most powerful land animals known to the ancient world, but she's accompanied by owls, birds that hunt in darkness. Every aspect of her is a contradiction, a paradox, a mixing of categories that shouldn't go together. This mixing of categories is exactly what we see in later descriptions of Lilith. She's Adam's wife, but also a demon. She's created by God but rebels against him. She's a mother who kills children. She's beautiful but monstrous. She's sexual but sterile. The Queen of the Night relief, whoever she depicts, shows us that this kind of paradoxical female figure was already fully formed in human imagination 2,000 years before the alphabet of Ben Sira would tell the story of Adam's first wife. Now, Let's talk about some of the specific details of this relief that connect to later Lilith traditions. Because even if this isn't actually Lilith, the connections are too interesting to ignore. First, those bird feet. In Jewish magical texts from 1,000 years later, Lilith is consistently described as having the feet of a bird, specifically a rooster or an owl. Some texts say you can identify her by looking at her feet, that no matter how beautiful her disguise, she can never hide her bird feet. Where did this specific detail come from? We can't be sure, but artifacts like the Burney relief show us this was an ancient way of marking a being as not quite human. Then there are the owls. In the ancient world, owls had a complex symbolism. They were associated with wisdom, yes, but also with death, night, and ill omens. The screech of an owl was thought to predict death. They were birds that hunted in darkness, that could see what humans couldn't, that moved silently through the night. In later Jewish texts, Lilith is sometimes called the screech owl or the night owl. The Hebrew word for Lilith might even be etymologically connected to the word for night bird. Is it coincidence that the queen of the night is flanked by owls? Maybe, but it's a pretty striking coincidence. The wings are another crucial detail. In ancient Mesopotamian art, wings could indicate divinity, but they could also mark beings who traveled between worlds. Demons especially were often depicted with wings because they needed to travel between the underworld, the human world, and the divine realm. The Lilith demons were said to ride on the wind, to slip through windows and doors, to appear and disappear at will. Wings weren't just decorative, they were functional, showing that this being wasn't bound by normal physical limitations. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of the relief is the figure's absolute confidence and power. She doesn't cower or hide. She doesn't seduce or plead. She stands there, naked and unashamed, holding symbols of divine authority, controlling the kings of beasts, staring directly at the viewer with an expression that's impossible to read. Is she welcoming? Threatening? Indifferent? We can't tell, and that ambiguity is part of her power. This is exactly how Lilith is portrayed in later texts. Utterly confident in her power, unashamed of her sexuality, willing to face down God himself rather than submit. The relief also gives us a window into ancient attitudes about female sexuality and power that would profoundly influence later Lilith traditions. In ancient Mesopotamia, female sexuality was seen as a powerful force that could be either creative or destructive. The goddess Ishtar used her sexuality to gain power, to seduce lovers, to wage war. Temple prostitutes served her by engaging in sacred sex acts. But female sexuality outside of proper channels was dangerous. Women who were too sexual, who refused marriage, who couldn't or wouldn't have children, were suspected of being demons or witches. The Queen of the Night embodies this duality perfectly. She's hypersexualized with her nudity and emphasized sexual characteristics. But she's also clearly not available. Those bird feet and wings mark her as other, unreachable, not a potential wife or mother. She displays her sexuality but on her own terms, for her own purposes. This is exactly the threat that Lilith would come to represent. Female sexuality that exists outside of male control, that serves its own purposes rather than those of husband or society. There's another aspect of this relief that often gets overlooked, but is crucial for understanding its possible connection to Lilith traditions. The figure is shown in what scholars call the frontal pose of power. In ancient Near Eastern art, most figures are shown in profile. To be shown completely frontally, staring directly out at the viewer, was unusual and significant. It indicated direct communication, confrontation, or challenge. Gods might be shown this way when they were issuing commands. Demons might be shown this way when they were threatening or cursing. The Queen of the Night isn't just being depicted. She's confronting us, challenging us, maybe even cursing us. When you see this relief in person at the British Museum, and I highly recommend you do if you ever get the chance, one thing that strikes you is how modern she seems. Not in her iconography or style, obviously, but in her attitude. She seems to be saying, "I am what I am, take it or leave it." There's no apology in her stance, no submission, no attempt to please or placate. This is a being who exists on her own terms. And isn't that exactly what the story of Lilith is about? A woman who would rather be a demon than a subordinate wife? The colors of the relief, though mostly faded now, tell their own story. Technical analysis has shown that the figure's body was originally painted pale, almost white, while her wings were red and black. The lions were yellow with black manes. The owls were lighter with darker details. But most interestingly, the background was originally black. This wasn't just a figure standing in space. She was emerging from darkness, from night itself. She was the queen of the night, not just in title but in visual representation. This connects to something profound about how ancient people understood night and darkness. For them, night wasn't just the absence of day. It was its own realm, with its own rulers, its own laws, its own dangers. The night was when the boundary between the human world and the spirit world became thinnest. It was when demons hunted, when spirits walked, when the normal rules didn't apply. To be the queen of the night wasn't just to rule over darkness. It was to rule over all the fears, dangers, and mysteries that darkness contained. As scholars have continued to study this relief, new theories have emerged. Some now argue that it might represent a specific myth or ritual we've lost. Others suggest it might be a cult statue from a temple dedicated to a syncretic goddess combining attributes of multiple deities. Still others think it might be a protective image, meant to scare away demons by showing an even more powerful demon. We may never know the truth, but in a way that uncertainty is fitting. Like Lilith herself, the Queen of the Night refuses to be pinned down, categorized, or fully understood. What we can say with certainty is that this relief proves that the image of a powerful, sexual, dangerous female figure with bird attributes existed in Mesopotamian culture at least 4,000 years ago. Whether this specific image influenced later Jewish descriptions of Lilith, or whether both drew on a common pool of ancient Near Eastern demon imagery, the similarities are undeniable. When medieval Jewish artists drew Lilith on amulets with bird feet and wings, when they described her as beautiful but monstrous, when they portrayed her as sexually powerful but ultimately sterile, they were drawing on iconographic traditions that went back millennia. But here's what I find most fascinating about the Burney relief and its possible connection to Lilith. This isn't just about tracking artistic influence or mythological evolution. This is about understanding how humans have always imagined female power that exists outside of patriarchal structures. The Queen of the Night, whoever she is, represents female power that doesn't come from being someone's wife, mother, or daughter. She stands alone, or rather, she stands on lions, above even the king of beasts. Her power is her own. This is the revolutionary idea that Lilith would come to embody. That a woman might choose freedom over security, power over acceptance, autonomy over love. Whether the Burney relief depicts Lilith, Ishtar, Ereshkigal, or some other forgotten deity, it shows us that this idea is ancient, that humans have been imagining and fearing and maybe secretly admiring such figures for thousands of years. As we move forward in our story, tracking Lilith from ancient Mesopotamia, to biblical prophecy, to rabbinic literature, to medieval mysticism, keep the image of the Queen of the Night in your mind. Because whether or not she is Lilith, she is what Lilith became in human imagination: beautiful and terrible, sexual and dangerous, divine and demonic, a queen of darkness who would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. And as we're about to see, when this ancient image collided with biblical interpretation and Jewish demonology, something entirely new would be born. A figure who would haunt human imagination for the next 2,000 years, and counting. Here's something that might shock you. Despite all the stories, legends, and traditions about Lilith that we've been discussing, she appears by name in the Hebrew Bible exactly once. Just once. One single word in one single verse in the entire Hebrew Bible. And even that one mention is so ambiguous that translators have been arguing about it for over 2,000 years. Some Bible translations don't even use the name Lilith at all, replacing it with screech owl or night creature or night monster, So if you've read the Bible cover to cover and never noticed Lilith, that's probably why. But that one word, that single mention in Isaiah chapter 34, verse 14, would become the seed from which an entire mythology would grow. Before we dive into that crucial verse, let me set the scene for you. Because context is everything when we're trying to understand ancient texts. The book of Isaiah was written during one of the most traumatic periods in Jewish history. The northern kingdom of Israel had already fallen to the Assyrians. The southern kingdom of Judah was under threat. The prophet Isaiah was warning his people about the consequences of turning away from God, and he was painting vivid, terrifying pictures of what would happen to their enemies. Chapter 34 is one of these prophecies of doom, specifically directed at Edom, the nation descended from Esau, Jacob's brother, and historically one of Israel's greatest enemies. Now, when ancient prophets wanted to describe total desolation, they had a whole vocabulary of horror to draw from. They would talk about cities becoming ruins, fertile land turning to desert, rivers drying up, and the complete absence of human life. But they would also describe these desolate places being inhabited by creatures that normal people would never want to encounter. And this is exactly what Isaiah does in chapter 34. He's painting a picture of Edom after God's judgment, when it's become a wasteland inhabited only by the kinds of creatures that thrive in ruins and darkness. Let me read you the verse in question, Isaiah 34:14, and I'll give you a fairly literal translation from the Hebrew. And desert creatures shall meet with howling creatures, and the goat demon shall call to his fellow. Surely there Lilith shall settle, and shall find for herself a resting place. That word I'm translating as Lilith is spelled in Hebrew, Lamed Yod Tav, Lilith. It appears nowhere else in the Hebrew Bible. This is it. This is the one and only time. But here's where things get complicated. That same verse has been translated dozens of different ways over the centuries. The ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint, which was made by Jewish scholars around 250 BCE, doesn't use the name Lilith at all. Instead, it uses the Greek word onokentaros, which means something like donkey centaur, a mythological creature that's half human, half donkey. Clearly, those ancient translators either didn't know what Lilith meant, or they thought their Greek-speaking audience wouldn't understand it, so they substituted a Greek monster instead. The Latin Vulgate, translated by Saint Jerome around 400 CE, uses the word lamia, which in Greek and Roman mythology was a child-eating monster. Jerome was clearly picking up on some tradition that connected Lilith with child-killing, which is interesting because that's not mentioned at all in Isaiah's text. It suggests that by Jerome's time, there were already traditions about Lilith that went beyond what was written in the Bible. English translations have been all over the map. The King James Version, published in 1611, uses screech owl. The Revised Standard Version uses night hag. The New International Version uses night creatures. The New Revised Standard Version actually uses Lilith, but puts it in a footnote explaining it might mean night monster. Only recently have some translations started using Lilith in the main text, acknowledging that this might be a proper name rather than just a description. So why all this confusion? Well, the Hebrew word Lilith could theoretically be related to the Hebrew word Layla, which means night, so it could just mean night creature or nocturnal thing, but it could also be a proper name, the name of a specific demon that Isaiah's audience would have recognized. Remember, Isaiah was writing either just before or during the Babylonian exile, when Jews were living in Mesopotamia where, as we've discussed, the Lily-two demons were well known. His audience might have understood exactly what he meant. But here's what's really important, and what often gets lost in all the discussion about Lilith. Look at the company she's keeping in this verse. Isaiah mentions desert creatures, howling creatures, and the Sair, which I translated as goat demon but which literally means an hairy one, and is usually understood to be some kind of satyr or demon. These aren't normal animals. This is a supernatural wasteland populated by demons and monsters. Lilith isn't just hanging out with owls and jackals. She's dwelling with other demonic beings in a cursed land. The verse also says something very specific about Lilith that's easy to miss but incredibly important. It says she will settle there and find for herself a resting place. The Hebrew words used here suggest permanence, comfort, even satisfaction. This isn't Lilith passing through or being forced to live in the wasteland. She's choosing it. She's making it her home. She finds rest there, peace there, a place where she belongs. In a land that's cursed and desolate for humans, Lilith is perfectly at home. This detail becomes incredibly important in later Jewish interpretation. If Lilith finds her rest in desolate, cursed places, what does that say about her nature? She's not just surviving in the wasteland, she's thriving there. She prefers the company of demons and monsters to that of humans. She finds peace in places that would terrify normal people. This single verse, this one mention, already paints Lilith as something fundamentally opposed to human civilization and divine order. Now I need to be very clear about something that disappoints a lot of people when they first learn about it. This verse in Isaiah says absolutely nothing about Lilith being Adam's first wife. Nothing. It doesn't connect her to the Garden of Eden, to Adam, to the creation story, to anything in Genesis at all. Isaiah doesn't explain who or what Lilith is. He seems to assume his audience already knows. He doesn't give her a backstory or describe her appearance or tell us anything about her except that she'll be living in the ruins of Edom with other demons. But that assumption, that Isaiah's audience would know who Lilith was without explanation, tells us something important. By the 6th century BCE, when Isaiah was writing, Lilith was already known in Jewish culture. She was familiar enough that a prophet could mention her in passing without needing to explain. But what did Isaiah's audience know about her? Did they know her as a Mesopotamian demon? As a native Hebrew night spirit? As something else entirely? We can get some clues by looking at how Isaiah uses similar language elsewhere in his book. Throughout Isaiah, we see a familiarity with Mesopotamian mythology and imagery. He knows about Babylonian gods and religious practices. He uses Mesopotamian mythological language to make his points. So when he drops the name Lilith into his prophecy, he's probably drawing on the Mesopotamian traditions we discussed earlier. His audience, especially those who had lived in Babylon, would have understood the reference. But here's where Isaiah does something clever and very Jewish. He takes this Mesopotamian demon and puts her in a thoroughly Hebrew context. She's not just any demon. She's a demon living in the ruins of Edom, Israel's ancient enemy. She's part of God's judgment on the nations that opposed Israel. In a way, Isaiah is saying that even the Mesopotamian demons serve God's purposes, that even Lilith is part of the divine plan for justice. This might seem like a small point, but it's actually revolutionary. In Mesopotamian religion, demons were independent forces of chaos that the gods had to constantly fight against. But in Isaiah's monotheistic worldview, even demons are ultimately under God's control. Lilith might be evil, might be dangerous, might be demonic, but she's living in Edom's ruins because that's part of God's plan. She's not a rival to God. She's an instrument of divine judgment. This theological move would have huge implications for how later Jewish texts would treat Lilith. She could be fearsome and dangerous, but she wasn't outside of God's power. She could be bargained with, bound by oaths, controlled by divine names and angelic powers. She was part of the created order, even if she was a rebellious part. This is very different from how she would be portrayed in some later traditions as a primordial force of chaos that existed before creation itself. There's another aspect of Isaiah's mention of Lilith that's worth considering. The prophet is using her as part of a horror show, a way of making the desolation of Edom sound as terrible as possible. But to work as horror, his audience had to already fear Lilith. You don't scare people by mentioning something they've never heard of or don't care about. The fact that Isaiah includes Lilith in his list of horrible things that will inhabit Edom's ruins tells us that his audience already feared her, already saw her as something terrible and dangerous. But what exactly did they fear? Based on just this verse, we can't be sure. But given what we know about contemporary Mesopotamian beliefs about the Lilith demons, and given what later Jewish texts would say about Lilith, we can make some educated guesses. They probably feared her as a night demon, as something that attacked people in their sleep, possibly as something that threatened pregnant women and babies. The fact that she's grouped with other demons and monsters suggests she was seen as fundamentally anti-human, as something that existed in opposition to normal life and society. Now you might be wondering, if Lilith only appears once in the Hebrew Bible, and that mention is so vague and ambiguous, how did she become such an important figure in Jewish mythology? This is where things get really interesting, and it has to do with how ancient texts were interpreted and reinterpreted over time. You see, for religious communities, Scripture isn't just a dead text from the past. It's a living document that speaks to each generation, and each generation reads it through their own experiences, their own knowledge, their own fears and hopes. So when later Jewish communities read Isaiah 34:14, they didn't just see a random demon in a list of monsters. They saw a puzzle to be solved, a mystery to be unraveled. Who was this Lilith? Why was she mentioned only once? What was her story? And as they tried to answer these questions, they drew on all the sources available to them. Mesopotamian demon traditions, Greek and Roman mythology, their own experiences with infant mortality and difficult childbirth, their theological struggles with the problem of evil, and eventually their need to explain those two different creation accounts in Genesis. The single mention of Lilith in Isaiah became like a seed crystal, around which layers and layers of tradition would form. Each generation would add new details, new stories, new explanations. The Babylonian Talmud would describe her as a demon, with long hair who attacks men who sleep alone. The medieval alphabet of Ben Sira would make her Adam's first wife. The Zohar would make her the queen of demons and the bride of Samael. Each text would build on what came before, creating an increasingly complex mythology around a figure who appears in the Bible only once. This process of elaboration and interpretation might seem strange to modern readers who expect texts to have one fixed meaning. But in the ancient and medieval world, this was how sacred texts worked. They were starting points for discussion, inspiration for interpretation, seeds for growing tradition. The fact that Isaiah told us so little about Lilith didn't limit later imagination. It freed it. Because Isaiah didn't give us Lilith's full story, later generations felt free to create that story for themselves. And create it they did. But before we get to those elaborate later traditions, we need to look at what happened in the centuries immediately after Isaiah. Because between Isaiah's brief mention and the Talmud's more detailed discussions, something important happened. Judaism encountered Hellenistic culture, Roman domination, and its own internal struggles with the nature of evil and the problem of suffering. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden in caves for 2,000 years, we find evidence that Lilith didn't disappear after Isaiah. She was still there, still feared, and multiplying. The desert that Isaiah said would be Lilith's home wasn't just a physical place. It was a metaphor for everything that existed outside of divine order, everything that threatened the chosen people, everything that came in the night when humans were vulnerable and afraid. And as we're about to see, the Jewish sectarians who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls knew exactly what lurked in that desert darkness, and they were prepared to fight it with every prayer, ritual, and incantation at their disposal. But before we turn to those ancient scrolls and their testimony about Lilith, take a moment to appreciate the irony here. The Hebrew Bible, the foundational text of Judaism, mentions Lilith exactly once in passing without explanation. Yet from that single mention would grow one of the most elaborate and enduring mythologies in Jewish tradition. It's as if Isaiah planted a seed in verse 14 of chapter 34, and that seed would grow into a vast tree whose branches would eventually stretch from ancient Babylon to medieval Spain to modern Manhattan, bearing fruit that was sometimes bitter, sometimes sweet, but always fascinating. That's the power of a single word in the right place at the right time. Lilith, 5 letters in Hebrew that would echo through millennia, inspiring fear, fascination, and endless speculation about the night demon who found her rest in the ruins of the world. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd boy was looking for a lost goat among the cliffs near the Dead Sea when he threw a rock into a cave and heard the sound of breaking pottery. That sound would turn out to be one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. Inside that cave and in 10 more caves discovered over the following years were thousands of ancient manuscript fragments that had been hidden for 2,000 years. These were the Dead Sea Scrolls, and among their many revelations about ancient Judaism was evidence that Lilith had not disappeared after Isaiah's brief mention. In fact, she had multiplied. The scrolls don't just mention Lilith. They mention Lilith's plural, suggesting that by the Second Temple period, Lilith had become not just a single demon, but an entire category of evil spirits that needed to be fought with prayer and ritual. But to understand what these scrolls tell us about Lilith, we need to first understand the world that produced them. The Second Temple period, roughly 516 BCE to 70 CE, was a time of incredible change and challenge for the Jewish people. They had returned from exile in Babylon, rebuilt their temple, and re-established their religious practices. But they were also living under foreign rule. First the Persians, then the Greeks, then the Romans. They were encountering new ideas, new philosophies, new religions, and perhaps most importantly for our story, they were developing an increasingly complex understanding of evil, demons, and the cosmic battle between good and evil. You see, the religion of ancient Israel, as reflected in most of the Hebrew Bible, didn't really have a developed demonology. There's Satan in Job, but he's more of a divine prosecutor than a demon. There are a few mentions of evil spirits, but nothing like the elaborate hierarchies of demons we find in later Judaism. But during the Second Temple period, especially after contact with Persian Zoroastrianism with its dualistic worldview of good versus evil, Judaism developed a rich and complex demonology, and Lilith was right at the heart of it. The Dead Sea Scrolls were written by a Jewish sect that most scholars identify with the Essenes, a group that had separated themselves from mainstream Jewish society and gone to live in the desert near the Dead Sea. They believed they were living in the end times, that the forces of darkness were gathering for a final battle with the forces of light, and that they needed to maintain absolute ritual purity to be ready for that battle. And part of maintaining that purity meant protecting themselves from demons, including the Liliths. The most explicit mention of Lilith in the Dead Sea Scrolls comes from a text known as the Songs of the Sage, found in Cave 4 at Qumran, and designated by scholars as 4Qi 5111. This text is essentially a collection of songs or incantations meant to be sung to drive away demons. And what's fascinating is that it doesn't mention Lilith singular, but Lilith's plural. Here's a translation of the relevant passage. "And I, the sage, declare the grandeur of his radiance in order to frighten and terrify all the spirits of the ravaging angels and the bastard spirits, demons, Liliths, owls, and jackals." Notice several things about this passage. First, Liliths are listed among other demons and evil spirits, suggesting they're part of a larger category of malevolent beings. Second, they're mentioned alongside owls and jackals, echoing Isaiah's association of Lilith with desert creatures. Third, and most importantly, these are spirits that need to be frightened and terrified by divine radiance. The Qumran community didn't see demons as all-powerful. They could be fought, driven away, defeated by the power of God. But who exactly were these Liliths, plural? The text doesn't give us a detailed description, but from the context and from other Second Temple period texts, we can piece together what the Qumran community believed. These were night demons, female spirits that attacked people in their sleep, that caused nightmares and nocturnal emissions, that threatened women in childbirth and newborn babies. The fact that they're plural suggests that Lilith had gone from being a unique individual demon to being a type of demon, a category, almost a species of evil spirit. This multiplication of Lilith into Liliths is actually a common pattern in the evolution of demon beliefs. A single named demon becomes so feared, so well known, that their name becomes a category. It's like how we use Judas to mean any traitor, or Jezebel to mean any wicked woman. By the Second Temple period, Lilith had become a term for any female night demon that exhibited certain characteristics: attacking sleepers, threatening babies, seducing men, causing nightmares. The Songs of the Sage also tells us something crucial about how these demons were fought. The text emphasizes the power of divine radiance, of God's light driving away the darkness where demons dwell. This isn't physical combat. It's spiritual warfare through prayer, incantation, and ritual purity. The Qumran community believed that by maintaining their purity, by constant prayer and study, by separating themselves from the corruption of the outside world, they could create a space where demons couldn't enter. But the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't the only Second Temple period texts that mention Lilith-like demons. Around the same time, probably in the 1st century CE, a Jewish text called the Testament of Solomon was being written. This text, which purports to tell the story of King Solomon's power over demons, includes a fascinating encounter with a female demon who sounds remarkably like later descriptions of Lilith. Her name in the text is Obizuth, and Solomon's encounter with her is worth examining in detail. According to the Testament, Obizuth appears to Solomon as a woman with disheveled hair, and when Solomon asks her what she does, she replies that she strangles newborn babies, causes pain to women in childbirth, and makes their ears deaf. She says she travels throughout the world, visiting women in childbirth, and if she's successful, she kills the child. If not, she retreats to another place because she can't remain in one place for more than a single night. Solomon asks her how she can be prevented, and she reveals that the angel Raphael can thwart her, and that writing her name on papyrus can drive her away. Does this sound familiar? A female demon with wild hair who kills babies and attacks women in childbirth, who can be stopped by angelic power and written amulets? This is essentially the same profile as Lilith, just with a different name. Some scholars argue that Obizuth is just Lilith under a Greek name. Others suggest she's a parallel tradition that later merged with Lilith legends. Either way, she shows us that by the 1st century CE, the idea of a baby-killing female demon was widespread in Jewish demonology. What's particularly interesting about the Testament of Solomon is that it presents demons not as abstract forces of evil, but as individuals with personalities, histories, and specific functions. Obizuth doesn't just randomly cause harm. She has a specific role, attacking mothers and babies. She has limitations. She can't stay in one place for long. She has weaknesses. She can be stopped by angelic intervention and protective amulets. This systematization of demonology, this cataloging of different demons and their characteristics, would become crucial for later Lilith traditions. The Second Temple period also saw the development of what scholars call incantation texts, formal prayers and spells designed to protect against specific demons. While most of the surviving examples come from later periods, references in Second Temple texts suggest these practices were already developing. People would recite specific formulas before going to sleep to protect against night demons. Pregnant women would wear amulets with protective texts. Newborn babies would be surrounded by written prayers. And many of these practices specifically targeted Lilith and her sister demons. But why did demonology become so elaborate during this period? Part of the answer lies in the historical context. The Jewish people were living under foreign occupation, experiencing persecution, struggling to maintain their identity and faith. The world seemed full of evil and danger that they couldn't control. Demons provided an explanation for this evil, and more importantly, a way to fight back. If your baby died, it wasn't random, meaningless tragedy. It was a demon attack, and you could take steps to prevent it next time. If you had terrifying nightmares or sleep paralysis, it wasn't just your mind playing tricks. It was a demon, and you could drive it away with the right prayers. The Persian influence on Jewish demonology during this period can't be overstated. The Persians had a highly developed dualistic religion, Zoroastrianism, which saw the world as a battlefield between the forces of light led by Ahura Mazda and the forces of darkness led by Angra Mainyu. This wasn't just good versus evil. It was two cosmic armies engaged in eternal warfare, with humans caught in the middle. While Judaism never fully adopted this dualism, always maintaining that God was ultimately supreme over all forces including evil, it did adopt the idea of organized demonic forces opposed to God's plan. This is the context in which Lilith evolved from a single demon mentioned by Isaiah to a whole category of demons feared by the Qumran community. She became part of what the Qumran texts call the lot of darkness, the assembly of evil spirits aligned against God and his chosen people. But she also retained her specific characteristics: the night attacks, the threat to babies and mothers, the sexual predation, the association with desolation and wilderness. The Dead Sea Scrolls also give us insight into how the Qumran community understood the relationship between demons and sin. In their worldview, demons weren't just external threats. They could also represent and embody human sins and weaknesses. The Liliths might attack from outside, but they were also connected to internal struggles with lust, impurity, and rebellion against divine order. This psychological dimension of demonology would become increasingly important in later Jewish mysticism, where Lilith would come to represent not just an external threat, but an internal spiritual challenge. One fragmentary text from Qumran, 4Q184, describes a seductress figure that some scholars have identified with Lilith, though she's not named explicitly. This figure is described as leading men astray with her beauty, causing them to abandon wisdom for folly, light for darkness. She dwells in the streets and marketplaces, seeking whom she might seduce. Her house is the entrance to Sheol, the underworld, and all who enter never return. While this text might be metaphorical, describing the dangers of foreign wisdom or heretical teachings, it shows how the image of the dangerous, seductive female was central to Qumran's understanding of spiritual danger. The Second Temple period also saw the development of elaborate angelologies to counter the growing demonologies. If there were hierarchies of demons, there were also hierarchies of angels. If demons had specific functions and jurisdictions, so did angels. And importantly for our story, specific angels were identified as having power over specific demons. This is the context in which the three angels who control Lilith, Senoi, Sansanoi, and Samangeloth would later emerge, though they are not mentioned by name in the Dead Sea Scrolls. What the Dead Sea Scrolls and other Second Temple texts show us is that by the time of Jesus, Lilith was firmly established in Jewish consciousness, not as a single demon, but as a category of demons, a type of threat that everyone recognized and feared. When Jesus cast out demons in the Gospels, when Paul wrote about spiritual warfare in his letters, when John described cosmic battles in Revelation, they were writing for audiences who knew about demons like the Liliths, who took their reality for granted, who had specific practices and prayers to protect against them. This context helps us understand how Lilith would continue to evolve in the Talmudic period. The rabbis who compiled the Talmud weren't creating Lilith beliefs out of nothing. They were inheriting centuries of tradition about night demons, female spirits, and cosmic evil. They were systematizing and regulating beliefs and practices that were already widespread in Jewish communities. When they discussed whether it was permitted to write amulets against Lilith, they were addressing real practices that real people were already doing. The Second Temple period, then, represents a crucial transformation in the Lilith tradition. She goes from being a single demon mentioned once by Isaiah to being a category of demons feared throughout the Jewish world. She becomes integrated into a complex demonology that includes hierarchies, functions, and countermeasures. She becomes not just a mythological figure, but a practical concern for everyday people trying to protect their families from harm. But perhaps most importantly, the Second Temple period establishes Lilith as a survivor. The temple was destroyed, the Qumran community was wiped out, the Jewish people were scattered across the world, but Lilith endured. The fears she represented were too deep, too primal, too universal to disappear. As long as babies died mysteriously in the night, as long as women faced the dangers of childbirth, as long as people had nightmares and night terrors, Lilith would have a place in human consciousness. As we move into the Talmudic period, we'll see how the rabbis dealt with this inherited tradition. They couldn't ignore Lilith. She was too embedded in popular consciousness. But they also couldn't fully embrace her without compromising their monotheistic theology. Their solution, as we'll see, was typically rabbinic. Acknowledge her existence, regulate practices around her, tell stories about her, but always maintain that ultimately, she too was under God's control. The wild demoness of the desert was about to meet the systematic legal minds of the Talmudic sages, and the result would be some of the most fascinating and bizarre passages in all of rabbinic literature. Picture this. You're a Jewish man living in Babylon in the 4th century CE. The sun has set, your family has gone to bed, and you're alone in your house, perhaps studying by lamplight or finishing some work. Suddenly you hear a sound, a whisper, maybe just the wind through a crack in the wall. But you know better. You know that according to the great rabbis whose teachings you've studied, this is the most dangerous time, when you're most vulnerable to an attack by Lilith. So you do what generations of Jewish men have done before you. You recite a protective formula, you check that your amulets are in place, and you pray that you'll survive the night without becoming another victim of the demon, who, according to the Talmud, seizes anyone who sleeps alone in a house. This isn't fantasy or folklore we're talking about. This is the Babylonian Talmud, one of the most important and authoritative texts in all of Judaism. A massive collection of rabbinic discussions and legal rulings that has shaped Jewish life for over 1,500 years. And scattered throughout its thousands of pages are references to Lilith that are so matter-of-fact, so casual, that they assume every reader knows exactly who she is and why she's dangerous. The rabbis who compiled the Talmud weren't creating new superstitions. They were dealing with beliefs about Lilith that were already so widespread, so deeply embedded in Jewish culture, that they couldn't be ignored. But here's what makes the Talmudic references to Lilith so fascinating. They're not systematic or consistent. Different rabbis in different contexts mention different aspects of her nature and behavior. It's as if we're getting glimpses of a much larger tradition, fragments of stories and beliefs that everyone knew, but that no one felt the need to explain fully. The Talmud assumes its readers already know who Lilith is. It's just filling in details, adding warnings, providing practical advice for dealing with her. The most famous Talmudic reference to Lilith comes from Tractate Shabbat, page 151b, where the text states simply and matter-of-factly, "One who sleeps alone in a house is seized by Lilith." That's it. No explanation of who Lilith is, no description of what happens when she seizes someone, no elaborate backstory. Just a straightforward warning that sleeping alone makes you vulnerable to her attack. But think about what this implies. By the time this passage was written, probably in the 5th or 6th century CE, Lilith was so well known among Babylonian Jews that the rabbis could mention her in passing without any need for explanation. But what exactly did it mean to be seized by Lilith? Other Talmudic passages give us clues. In Tractate Niddah, page 24b, there's a discussion about various supernatural beings, and Lilith is described as having a human face but wings and long hair that flows freely. The text suggests that her long hair is somehow connected to her power, that it's part of what makes her dangerous. This detail about Lilith's hair would become incredibly important in later traditions, where cutting or binding her hair was seen as a way to control her power. The Talmud also connects Lilith to sexual danger and nocturnal emissions. In several passages, there are discussions about men who have erotic dreams or wake up with evidence of sexual activity they don't remember. The rabbis attribute these experiences to demonic visitation, and while Lilith isn't always named explicitly, the descriptions match what other sources tell us about her behavior. She visits men in their sleep, appears to them as a beautiful woman, seduces them in their dreams, and leaves them exhausted and drained. But perhaps the most intriguing Talmudic reference to Lilith comes from Tractate Eruvin, pages 18b-19a, in a passage that would later become crucial for the development of the Adam and Lilith story. The text discusses the period when Adam was separated from Eve, and it mentions that during this time, Adam begot spirits and demons and Lilin. The word Lilin is the plural of Lilith, suggesting that Adam somehow fathered a whole race of Lilith-like demons. The passage doesn't explain how this happened or who the mother of these demons was, but later interpreters would use this as evidence that Adam had a relationship with Lilith before he was reunited with Eve. This passage in Eruvin is particularly fascinating because it connects Lilith to the very beginning of human history. According to this tradition, demons aren't just random forces of chaos. They're actually related to humanity, descended from Adam himself. This makes them more dangerous in some ways, because they understand humans intimately. But it also makes them more controllable, because they're part of the created order rather than primordial forces of chaos. The Talmud also provides practical advice for protecting oneself from Lilith. In addition to the warning about not sleeping alone, there are references to protective amulets, specific prayers, and ritual precautions. The text mentions that certain divine names have power over demons, that specific angels can provide protection, and that written formulas can ward off demonic attacks. While the Talmud doesn't give us the full text of these protective measures, it's clear that by this period, there was already a well-developed tradition of anti-Lilith magic. One particularly interesting aspect of the Talmudic treatment of Lilith is how it balances acknowledgement of her reality with maintenance of monotheistic theology. The rabbis never suggest that Lilith is a rival to God or that she operates outside of divine control. Even when they describe her attacks and warn about her dangers, they maintain that she's ultimately subject to God's will and can be controlled through proper religious observance. This is a delicate theological balance, acknowledging popular beliefs about demons, while ensuring that those beliefs don't compromise the fundamental Jewish commitment to monotheism. The Talmud also reveals something important about the social context of Lilith beliefs. The warning about sleeping alone suggests that Lilith was particularly associated with solitary men, perhaps bachelors or widowers or men whose wives were away. This makes sense when we consider the sexual nature of her attacks. She preys on men who are sexually isolated, who don't have the protection of a proper marriage relationship. In a culture that strongly emphasized marriage and family, Lilith represented the dangers that lurked outside of proper social structures. But Lilith wasn't just a threat to men. Other Talmudic passages, while not always naming her explicitly, describe female demons who attack pregnant women and newborn babies. These demons are said to strangle infants in their cribs, to cause miscarriages, to make childbirth difficult and dangerous. While the Talmud doesn't always connect these attacks directly to Lilith, later traditions would make her the primary perpetrator of these crimes against mothers and children. The Talmudic period also saw the development of more sophisticated demonology that would provide the framework for later Lilith traditions. The rabbis discussed different types of demons, their various powers and limitations, the times and places where they were most active, and the methods for controlling or banishing them. They created elaborate taxonomies of evil spirits, with different demons having different specialties and jurisdictions. In this system, Lilith occupied a particular niche as a night demon, who specialized in sexual attacks and threats to family life. One of the most important developments in Talmudic demonology was the idea that demons could be bound by oaths and contracts. This wasn't just theoretical theology, it had practical implications. If demons could be forced to swear oaths, then they could be controlled through the right rituals and formulas. This concept would become crucial in later Lilith traditions, where she's forced to swear that she won't harm children who are protected by certain amulets or who are under the protection of specific angels. The Talmud also introduces the idea that demons have their own society, their own hierarchies, their own rules and customs. They're not just chaotic forces of destruction. They're organized, intelligent beings with their own culture. This anthropomorphization of demons made them more relatable, but also more threatening. A mindless force of destruction might be easier to understand than an intelligent enemy who could plan, scheme, and adapt. In Tractate Baba Bathra, page 73a, there's a fascinating passage that mentions Lilith in the context of other supernatural beings. The text describes a journey where the narrator encounters various demons and spirits, including Lilith dancing. This brief mention is tantalizing because it suggests that Lilith wasn't always portrayed as purely malevolent. Dancing implies celebration, joy, perhaps even beauty. This more complex portrayal of Lilith, as a being capable of both beauty and terror, would become important in later traditions. The Talmudic references to Lilith also reveal something about the geographic spread of these beliefs. The Babylonian Talmud was compiled in Mesopotamia, the same region where the ancient Lilith demons were first feared thousands of years earlier. But references in other rabbinic texts suggest that Lilith beliefs had spread throughout the Jewish world. From Babylon to Palestine to North Africa to Europe, Jewish communities knew about Lilith and took precautions against her. What's particularly striking about the Talmudic treatment of Lilith is how it normalizes her existence. The rabbis don't present belief in Lilith as superstition or ignorance. They treat her as a real threat that requires real precautions. They discuss her in the same matter-of-fact way they discuss legal procedures or ritual requirements. This suggests that by the Talmudic period, belief in Lilith was so universal among Jews that questioning her existence would have seemed absurd. But the Talmud also shows us the beginning of attempts to systematize and regulate Lilith beliefs. While the rabbis acknowledged her reality, they also tried to establish proper procedures for dealing with her. They discussed which protective measures were permissible under Jewish law, which amulets could be worn on the Sabbath, which formulas were effective, and which were mere superstition. This regulatory approach would become increasingly important as Lilith traditions continued to develop. The Talmudic period also saw the emergence of professional demon fighters within Jewish communities. These weren't just random folk healers or superstitious practitioners. They were learned men who combined deep knowledge of Jewish law and tradition with expertise in demonology and protective magic. They knew which biblical verses had power over demons, which divine names could compel obedience, which rituals could provide protection, and Lilith was one of their primary concerns. As we read these Talmudic passages about Lilith, we need to remember that we're not just looking at ancient superstitions or primitive beliefs. We're seeing how real people in real communities dealt with real fears and anxieties. The fear of sleeping alone, the terror of losing a child, the confusion about sexual dreams and nocturnal emissions, the need to explain why terrible things happen to good people. These are universal human concerns. Lilith provided an explanation and, more importantly, a way to fight back. The Talmudic treatment of Lilith also shows us how religious traditions adapt and evolve. The rabbis couldn't simply dismiss beliefs that were so widespread and deeply held. Instead, they incorporated them into their religious system, regulated them, theologized them, made them compatible with Jewish monotheism. They transformed Lilith from a pagan demon into a Jewish demon, subject to Jewish law and controllable through Jewish ritual. But perhaps most importantly, the Talmudic period established Lilith as a permanent part of Jewish consciousness. By including her in their authoritative legal and theological discussions, the rabbis ensured that she would be remembered, studied, and feared for generations to come. They gave her a place in the official tradition, not just in folk belief. And once she was part of the Talmud, she was part of Judaism forever. As we move forward in our story, we'll see how these Talmudic foundations would support increasingly elaborate traditions about Lilith. The brief mentions and casual references in the Talmud would be expanded into full narratives. The practical warnings about sleeping alone would become elaborate stories about Adam's first wife. The descriptions of her long hair and wings would inspire detailed artistic depictions. But all of these later developments would build on the foundation laid in the Talmudic period, when Lilith went from being a demon mentioned by prophets to being a recognized and regulated part of Jewish religious life. The night terror had become domesticated, not tamed but acknowledged, not defeated but managed. And in the centuries to come, that management would require increasingly sophisticated tools, magic bowls, protective amulets, elaborate incantations, and eventually, a complete mythology that would explain not just what Lilith was, but who she had been before she became the enemy of every sleeping man and every newborn child. Imagine you're an archaeologist working in Iraq in the early 20th century, carefully excavating the ruins of ancient Jewish homes in what was once Babylonia. You're digging through layers of sand and debris when suddenly your trowel hits something hard. You brush away the dirt and find yourself staring at a clay bowl, about the size of a dinner plate, covered in spiraling text written in an ancient script. As you clean it off and begin to translate the Aramaic words, you realize you're holding something extraordinary, a 2,000-year-old magical weapon designed to trap and bind demons. And there, written in the spiraling incantation that covers the bowl from rim to center, you see a name that makes your heart race: Lilith. This isn't a hypothetical scenario. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these bowls, buried upside down under the thresholds and in the corners of ancient Jewish homes throughout Mesopotamia. They date from roughly 400 to 700 CE, and they represent one of the most fascinating and direct pieces of evidence we have for how ordinary Jewish families dealt with their fear of Lilith and her demon sisters. These weren't theoretical theological discussions or abstract mythological stories. These were practical tools, commissioned by real families, written by professional scribes, and buried in real homes to protect real people from what they believed was a very real threat. The bowls themselves are remarkable artifacts. Most are made of simple clay, the kind used for everyday pottery, but they're transformed into powerful magical instruments through the text that covers them. The writing typically starts at the rim and spirals inward toward the center, creating a kind of textual trap. The idea was that demons, following the text as they read it, would be drawn into the center of the bowl and trapped there, unable to escape. Some bowls also contain drawings, crude but powerful images of bound demons, protective angels, or magical symbols. These weren't beautiful works of art. They were functional objects designed to save lives. But what makes these bowls absolutely crucial for understanding Lilith is that they give us our first detailed look at how she was actually perceived and fought against by ordinary people. The Talmudic references we discussed earlier were brief and assumed knowledge. The biblical mention in Isaiah was cryptic, but the incantation bowls spell everything out in explicit detail. They name Lilith, describe her activities, list her victims, and provide specific formulas for controlling her. They're like instruction manuals for demon fighting, written by and for people who took this threat absolutely seriously. Let me share with you the text from one particularly well-preserved bowl, currently housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. The incantation begins, "Bound and sealed and tied up are the evil Lilith and Lilith the maiden, and Lilith hag of the desert, and all their kinds and types and families and generations." Notice several things about this opening. First, there are multiple Liliths, different types with different names and characteristics. Second, they have kinds and types and families and generations, suggesting an entire demonic hierarchy or species. Third, the language is legal and binding. Bound and sealed and tied up sounds like a contract or court order. The bowl continues, "Bound are the Liliths in the name of he who spoke and the world came to be, with a bond that cannot be loosened, and a knot that cannot be untied, and a seal that cannot be broken." This is fascinating because it shows how Jewish magical practice worked. The power to bind demons doesn't come from the magician or the bowl itself. It comes from God, specifically from God's creative power. The phrase, "He who spoke and the world came to be," refers to the creation story in Genesis, where God creates through speech. The implication is that the same divine power that created the world can also bind demons. But the bowl doesn't stop with general binding formulas. It gets specific about what Lilith does and why she needs to be stopped. Bound is the evil Lilith who strangles children and kills infants and causes women to miscarry and makes them barren and kills the fruit of their wombs and dries up their milk. This is our most detailed ancient description of Lilith's crimes, and it's absolutely chilling. She's not just a night demon who bothers sleeping men. She's a systematic destroyer of family life, targeting the most vulnerable members of society: pregnant women, new mothers, and babies. The bowl continues with even more specific details. And she appears to men in the form of a woman, and to women in the form of a man, and she lies with them and takes from them seed and gives birth to demons and spirits and devils, and sends them against the children of men. This passage is crucial because it explains how Lilith reproduces. She can't have children naturally, so she steals human seed through sexual encounters and uses it to create demon offspring. This belief would become central to later Lilith traditions and would explain why she was seen as particularly dangerous to men who slept alone. What's remarkable about these bowls is how they combine theological sophistication with practical magic. The scribes who wrote them were clearly learned men who knew Hebrew, Aramaic, and the traditions of Jewish law and lore. But they were also practicing magicians who knew how to write effective incantations, how to bind demons, how to protect families. They weren't operating outside of Jewish tradition. They were applying that tradition to solve real-world problems. The bowls also reveal something fascinating about the social context of Lilith beliefs. Many of the bowls were commissioned by women, often specifically to protect during pregnancy and childbirth. One bowl from the 6th century CE was written for a woman named Marduk and includes this plea: "Just as you are bound, Lilith, so may you be bound from the house of Marduk, daughter of Noenduch, and from her children and from her offspring and from her family." This isn't abstract theology. This is a terrified mother trying to protect her family using every tool available to her. The bowls also introduce us to the three angels who would become central to later Lilith traditions: Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Samanjaloth. These names appear in multiple bowls, always in the context of controlling Lilith. One bowl states, "In the name of Sinoi and Sansonoi and Samanjaloth, the three angels who were sent after Lilith." This is our earliest reference to these angels, and it suggests that by the 6th century CE, there was already a well-developed tradition about angelic beings who had special power over Lilith. But who were these angels? Their names don't appear in the Bible or in standard Jewish angelology. They seem to be specifically anti-Lilith angels, created or designated for the sole purpose of controlling her. Some scholars suggest their names are corruptions of Hebrew words meaning change, secret, and palm, possibly referring to their functions or attributes. Others argue they're entirely magical names, created specifically for incantation purposes. Whatever their origin, they would become absolutely central to Lilith protection rituals for the next 1,000 years. The bowls also show us how Lilith beliefs spread and evolved across different communities. Bowls have been found not just in Jewish homes, but also in Christian and Mandaean households, suggesting that fear of Lilith crossed religious boundaries. The basic formula remained the same, but different communities adapted it to their own theological frameworks. Christian bowls might invoke Jesus or Christian saints, alongside the traditional anti-Lilith angels. This cross-cultural spread shows how powerful and persistent these beliefs were. One particularly fascinating aspect of the bowl tradition is how it deals with the legal aspects of demon binding. Many bowls read like contracts or court documents with specific terms and conditions for the demon's behavior. One bowl includes this clause: "And if you do not obey and do not accept upon yourselves this ban and this curse and this oath, then there shall come upon you the curse of Joshua son of Nun and the curse of Caleb son of Jephunneh." The demons aren't just being magically compelled, they're being legally bound with specific penalties for violation. The bowls also reveal the professional nature of anti-demon magic in this period. Many bowls include the name of the scribe who wrote them, and some scribes' names appear on multiple bowls, suggesting they had established practices as magical specialists. These weren't random folk healers. They were trained professionals who combined religious learning with magical expertise. They knew which formulas worked, which divine names had power, which angels could be invoked for specific purposes. Some bowls also include what we might call customer testimonials, references to previous successful bindings of Lilith. One bowl states, "Just as you were bound from the house of Abraham our father, so may you be bound from this house." This creates a sense of continuity and proven effectiveness. If the magic worked for Abraham, it should work for this family too. It also connects contemporary demon fighting to biblical precedent, making the practice seem more legitimate and traditional. The geographic spread of these bowls is also significant. They've been found throughout Mesopotamia, from Babylon to Nippur to Ctesiphon, showing that Lilith beliefs were widespread throughout the Jewish communities of the Sasanian Empire. But they've also been found in other regions where Jews lived, suggesting that the tradition traveled with Jewish communities as they migrated and established new settlements. The bowls also show us how Lilith beliefs adapted to local conditions. Bowls found in different regions sometimes include references to local demons or protective spirits alongside Lilith. This suggests that Lilith wasn't seen as the only supernatural threat, but as part of a larger ecosystem of spiritual dangers that families needed to protect against. She was the most feared, perhaps, but not the only one. One of the most intriguing aspects of the bowl tradition is how it handles the question of Lilith's appearance. Several bowls include detailed descriptions of how to recognize her. She has long hair that flows freely, and wings like a bird, and feet like a rooster, and she appears sometimes as a young woman and sometimes as an old hag. These descriptions would become standard in later Lilith traditions, but the bowls give us our earliest detailed physical descriptions of her. The bowls also reveal something important about the timing of Lilith's attacks. Many specify that she's most dangerous at night, particularly during the new moon when darkness is deepest. They also identify specific vulnerable periods: the first 40 days after childbirth, the 8 days before a boy's circumcision, the time when a woman is ritually impure after menstruation. These aren't random times. They're periods when people are already vulnerable, when normal social and religious protections might be weakened. As we study these bowls, we need to remember that they represent real fear, real desperation, real hope. The families who commissioned them weren't playing games or indulging in superstition for entertainment. They were trying to protect their most precious possessions, their children, their wives, their future generations. In a world where infant mortality was high, where childbirth was dangerous, where unexplained deaths were common, Lilith provided an explanation, and these bowls provided a solution. The bowl tradition also shows us how Jewish communities maintained their religious identity while adapting to local conditions. The bowls are thoroughly Jewish in their theology and language, invoking the God of Israel, citing biblical precedents, using Hebrew and Aramaic formulas. But they also show awareness of local magical traditions, incorporating elements that would be familiar to non-Jewish neighbors. This balance between maintaining distinctiveness and adapting to local conditions would characterize Jewish communities throughout history. As the bowl tradition developed, it also became more standardized. Early bowls show considerable variation in formulas and approaches. Later bowls tend to use more consistent language and invoke the same protective figures. This suggests the development of a professional tradition, with established practices and proven formulas being passed down from master to student. The bowls also give us insight into the economic aspects of demon protection. Commissioning a bowl required paying a professional scribe, obtaining quality clay, and sometimes adding expensive materials like silver or gold for enhanced protection. This wasn't cheap magic. It was a significant investment that families made because they believed their lives depended on it. But perhaps most importantly, the bowl tradition shows us Lilith at her most dangerous and most feared. These aren't the later romanticized or theologized versions of her story. This is Lilith as pure threat, as destroyer of families, as enemy of human happiness and continuity. The bowls don't try to explain her motivations or give her a sympathetic backstory. They simply acknowledge her power and provide tools for fighting her. As we move forward in our story, we'll see how these practical magical traditions would eventually merge with theological speculation and mythological storytelling to create the elaborate Lilith narratives of the medieval period. But the bowls remind us that underneath all the later stories and interpretations, Lilith remained what she had always been: a night terror that parents feared would steal their children, a sexual predator that men feared would drain their life force, a destroyer of families that communities fought against with every tool at their disposal. The clay bowls buried under ancient thresholds were the front lines of a war that had been going on for thousands of years, and would continue for thousands more. And in that war, Lilith was winning more battles than she was losing. It would take something more than magic bowls to contain her. It would take a story, a narrative that would explain not just what she was, but who she had been and why she had become humanity's enemy. That story was coming, and it would change everything. In the dusty archives of medieval manuscripts, hidden among collections of Jewish folklore and wisdom literature, lies one of the most controversial and influential texts in the history of demonology. It's called the Alphabet of Ben Sira, and it contains the first complete story of Lilith as Adam's first wife. But here's what makes this text so fascinating and so problematic. It wasn't written as serious theology or authoritative scripture. It was entertainment literature, a collection of often satirical, sometimes crude, frequently shocking stories that were meant to amuse and provoke as much as to instruct. Yet from this unlikely source would emerge the narrative that would define Lilith for the next 1,000 years and counting. The Alphabet of Ben Sira is a strange book, even by medieval standards. It purports to be the wisdom of Ben Sira, the author of the biblical book of Ecclesiasticus, but it's clearly a much later work, probably written sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries CE. The book is structured as a series of questions and answers, with various characters asking Ben Sira about puzzling aspects of scripture, history, and human nature. His answers are often unexpected, sometimes shocking, and frequently hilarious in their irreverence toward established tradition. But when we get to the question about Lilith, the tone shifts dramatically. The story that follows is detailed, coherent, and surprisingly serious, as if the author suddenly stopped joking and started telling a story he actually believed. The question that prompts the Lilith narrative is deceptively simple. Why are there two different creation stories in Genesis? It's a question that had puzzled Jewish scholars for centuries, and the Alphabet of Ben Sira provides an answer that's both brilliant and disturbing. Let me tell you the story exactly as the Alphabet of Ben Sira tells it, because every detail matters for understanding how this narrative would shape centuries of Lilith tradition. The story begins with God creating the first human beings, but unlike the familiar story where Adam is created first and Eve is made from his rib, this version follows the first creation account in Genesis 1:27, where it says God created them male and female. According to Ben Sira, God created Adam and Lilith at the same time, from the same earth as equals. From the very beginning there was trouble in paradise. The problem wasn't disobedience to God or eating forbidden fruit. The problem was sex, specifically the question of who would be on top during sexual intercourse. When Adam approached Lilith for sexual relations, he expected her to lie beneath him in what we would now call the missionary position. But Lilith refused. Her response, as recorded in the text, is one of the most powerful statements of gender equality in all of ancient literature. Why should I lie beneath you when I was created from the same earth as you? We are both equal, for we are both from the earth. Think about what this means. Before there was any sin in the world, before there was any disobedience to God, before there was any knowledge of good and evil, there was already conflict between man and woman over the fundamental question of equality versus hierarchy. Lilith's argument is perfectly logical. If they were both created from the same material by the same God at the same time, why should one be subordinate to the other? It's a question that would resonate through centuries of gender relations and religious interpretation. Adam, however, wouldn't accept this argument. He insisted on his superiority, his right to be on top, his authority over his wife. The text doesn't give us his reasoning, but we can imagine it. Perhaps he was physically stronger. Perhaps he felt entitled as the male. Perhaps he simply couldn't conceive of equality in sexual relations. Whatever his reasoning, he refused to compromise, and Lilith refused to submit. What happened next is the most dramatic moment in the entire story. Faced with Adam's intransigence, Lilith made a choice that would echo through eternity. She spoke the ineffable name of God, the secret name that contains all divine power, the name that observant Jews to this day will not pronounce. By speaking this name, Lilith gained the power of flight, and she used it to escape from the Garden of Eden entirely. Let's pause for a moment to consider the implications of this act. Lilith didn't just leave her husband, she left paradise itself. She chose exile over submission, freedom over security, autonomy over love. She was willing to give up eternal bliss rather than accept a subordinate position. And she accomplished this escape by using God's own power, by speaking the divine name that Adam apparently didn't know or couldn't use. In this moment, Lilith becomes the first rebel, the first feminist, the first being to choose independence over imposed hierarchy. But the story doesn't end with Lilith's escape. Adam, finding himself alone, complained to God about his wife's departure. God's response reveals something important about the divine perspective on this conflict. God didn't punish Lilith for leaving or force her to return. Instead, God sent 3 angels to negotiate with her, Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Samangeloth. These are the same 3 angels we encountered in the incantation bowls, but now we learn their origin story. The angels found Lilith by the Red Sea, a location that's symbolically perfect for this story. In Jewish tradition, the Red Sea represents the boundary between slavery and freedom, the place where the Israelites escaped from Egyptian bondage. It's also associated with chaos, danger, and the primordial waters of creation. By placing Lilith at the Red Sea, the story suggests she's in a liminal space, between the ordered world of Eden and the chaotic realm of the wilderness. When the angels delivered God's ultimatum, return to Adam or face punishment, Lilith's response was defiant and heartbreaking. She refused to return, declaring that she would rather accept any punishment than submit to Adam's authority. The angels then pronounced a terrible curse. 100 of her children would die every single day for all eternity. This is a punishment of almost unimaginable cruelty, designed to attack Lilith at her most vulnerable point, her maternal instincts. But even this horrific curse didn't break Lilith's resolve. She accepted the punishment, but she also swore a counter-oath of revenge. She would attack human women in childbirth, strangle newborn babies in their cribs, seduce men in their sleep, and use their seed to create demon children to replace the ones she lost daily. She would become humanity's enemy, the destroyer of families, the killer of children, the seducer of men. However, the story includes one crucial limitation on Lilith's power. She made a binding oath to the 3 angels that if she saw their names or images on an amulet, she would not harm that child. This oath explains the protective power of the amulets we discussed earlier and provides a practical solution for families who feared her attacks. Knowledge of the 3 angels' names became a weapon against Lilith, a way to turn her own oath against her. The story concludes with God creating Eve from Adam's rib to replace the departed Lilith. This explains why there are 2 creation accounts in Genesis. The first describes the creation of Adam and Lilith as equals, while the second describes the creation of Eve as Adam's subordinate, made from his body rather than from the earth. Eve, unlike Lilith, accepts her subordinate position and becomes the mother of humanity. Now, you might be wondering, how seriously should we take this story? After all, it comes from a text that's often satirical and irreverent. Some scholars argue that the Lilith story is meant as a parody of rabbinic interpretation, a way of showing how absurd these elaborate explanations of biblical contradictions could become. Others suggest it's a folk tale that the author included because it was already well known, not because he invented it. But regardless of the author's intent, the story had an enormous impact on Jewish culture and beyond. It provided a complete narrative framework for understanding Lilith, explaining not just what she was, but who she had been and why she had become humanity's enemy. It transformed her from a random demon into a tragic figure, a woman who had been wronged and who was seeking revenge. It made her sympathetic even as it portrayed her as dangerous. The story also provided a theological framework for understanding gender relations within Jewish thought. Lilith represents the dangers of female equality, the chaos that results when women refuse to accept their proper subordinate role. But she also represents the injustice of that subordination, the tragedy of a woman who was created as an equal, but forced to choose between submission and exile. The alphabet of Ben Sira's version of the Lilith story also explains several puzzling aspects of earlier traditions. Why was Lilith particularly dangerous to pregnant women and newborn babies? Because she was seeking revenge for her own lost children. Why did she seduce men in their sleep? Because she needed their seed to create demon offspring to replace her daily losses. Why could she be controlled by certain angelic names? Because she had sworn an oath to those angels that bound her power. The story also provides a framework for understanding the relationship between sexuality and spirituality that would become central to later Jewish mysticism. Lilith's rebellion begins with a sexual conflict, and her revenge takes sexual forms. She represents sexuality outside of proper channels, desire that serves its own purposes rather than those of family and society. In later Kabbalistic thought, this would be developed into elaborate theories about the relationship between sexual energy and cosmic forces. But perhaps most importantly, the alphabet of Ben Sira's story gives Lilith agency and motivation. She's not just a random force of evil or a mindless destroyer. She's a being who made choices, who had reasons for her actions, who was responding to injustice with injustice. This psychological complexity would make her a far more compelling figure than a simple demon could ever be. The story also raises profound questions about justice, equality, and the nature of rebellion. Was Lilith right to demand equality with Adam? Was her rebellion justified? Was God's punishment fair? Was Adam's insistence on hierarchy natural or arbitrary? These questions don't have easy answers, and the text doesn't provide them. Instead, it presents a complex moral situation where both sides have legitimate grievances and where the consequences of the conflict affect all of humanity. As this story spread through Jewish communities, it was adapted, elaborated, and interpreted in countless ways. Some versions emphasized Lilith's evil nature and the justice of her punishment. Others focused on the tragedy of her situation and the unfairness of her treatment. Some saw her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of female rebellion. Others read her as a proto-feminist hero who chose freedom over oppression. The story also had practical implications for Jewish family life. It provided a framework for understanding and dealing with the dangers of childbirth and infant mortality. It explained why certain protective rituals were necessary and effective. It gave families a way to fight back against forces that seemed random and inexplicable. But the alphabet of Ben Sira's story was just the beginning. Once this narrative framework was established, other authors would build on it, adding new details, exploring new implications, developing new interpretations. The simple story of a marital conflict in Eden would grow into an elaborate mythology involving cosmic forces, mystical symbolism, and profound theological speculation. As we move forward in our exploration of Lilith's evolution, we'll see how this foundational story was developed and transformed by later authors. We'll see how Lilith went from being Adam's rebellious first wife to being the queen of demons, the bride of Satan, and a fundamental force of cosmic evil. But all of these later developments would build on the foundation laid by the alphabet of Ben Sira, the story of a woman who chose exile over submission and who has been seeking revenge ever since. The birth of the first wife story was complete. Now it was time for that story to grow, evolve, and ultimately transform Lilith from a tragic figure into something far more cosmic and terrifying. The woman who had said no to Adam was about to become the queen of all who say no to God. By the 11th century, something extraordinary was happening to the story of Lilith. What had begun as a relatively simple tale in the alphabet of Ben Sira about a marital dispute in Eden was growing, expanding, becoming more elaborate and more terrifying with each retelling. Jewish scholars and storytellers across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East were adding new chapters to Lilith's biography, transforming her from Adam's rebellious first wife into something far more cosmic and dangerous, the queen of demons herself. But this transformation didn't happen overnight, and it wasn't the work of a single author. Instead, it was a gradual process of elaboration and interpretation that would span several centuries and involve dozens of texts, each adding new layers to an increasingly complex mythology. The medieval expansion of Lilith's story reflects the broader changes happening in Jewish culture during this period. The Jewish communities of medieval Europe and the Islamic world were experiencing unprecedented intellectual flowering. They were encountering new philosophical ideas from Greek and Arabic sources, developing sophisticated mystical traditions, and creating elaborate theological systems that tried to explain the nature of good and evil, the structure of the cosmos, and humanity's place in the divine plan. Lilith became a crucial figure in these developments, representing the dark side of creation, the feminine aspect of evil, and the cosmic forces that opposed divine order. One of the most important developments in medieval Lilith traditions was the elaboration of her life after leaving Eden. The alphabet of Ben Sira had left her by the Red Sea, accepting her punishment and swearing revenge against humanity. But medieval authors wanted to know what happened next. Where did she go? How did she live? What was her daily existence like as the enemy of mankind? The answers they provided were both fascinating and terrifying. According to these medieval elaborations, Lilith didn't remain by the Red Sea. Instead, she traveled to a realm called Zemargad, described as a great city or palace located somewhere in the depths of the earth or in the far reaches of the desert. This wasn't just any demonic dwelling. It was portrayed as a magnificent kingdom with Lilith as its absolute ruler. She wasn't just a wandering demon. She was a queen with subjects, armies, and vast territories under her control. The descriptions of Zemargad and Lilith's court there are remarkably detailed in some medieval texts. She was said to rule over 480 bands of demons, each band containing thousands of individual spirits. These weren't random chaotic forces. They were organized armies with specific functions and hierarchies. Some specialized in attacking pregnant women, others in seducing men, still others in causing diseases or natural disasters. Lilith was portrayed as a master strategist, coordinating these various demonic forces in a systematic campaign against humanity. But perhaps the most significant development in medieval Lilith traditions was her romantic relationship with Samael, the angel of death, who had become the Jewish equivalent of Satan. This wasn't mentioned in the alphabet of Ben Sira, but by the 12th century, it was becoming a standard part of Lilith's story. According to these traditions, after leaving Adam, Lilith eventually became the consort of Samael, making her not just a demon queen, but the bride of the Prince of Darkness himself. This relationship with Samael transformed Lilith from a wronged woman seeking personal revenge into a cosmic force of evil. She was no longer just angry at Adam and his descendants. She was actively working to undermine God's entire creation. Her attacks on pregnant women and babies weren't just personal vendettas. They were part of a larger campaign to prevent human reproduction and ultimately destroy the human race. Her seduction of men wasn't just sexual predation. It was a systematic effort to corrupt human sexuality and turn it away from its proper divine purposes. The medieval texts also provided much more detail about Lilith's methods and capabilities. She was described as a master of disguise, who could appear as any woman, young or old, beautiful or hideous depending on her purposes. She could transform herself into animals, particularly cats, owls, and serpents. She could become invisible or appear as a shadow. She could travel instantly across vast distances, slipping through walls and locked doors as easily as moving through open air. One particularly fascinating aspect of medieval Lilith traditions was the development of her relationship with other female demons. She wasn't portrayed as working alone, but as the leader of a sisterhood of evil spirits. The most commonly mentioned of these sister demons were Agrat Bat Mahlat, Nama, and Isheth Zenunim. Each had her own specialties and territories, but all acknowledged Lilith as their queen and superior. Agrat Bat Mahlat was described as the dancer of rooftops, a demon who specialized in seducing men by appearing to them on rooftops and balconies, dancing seductively until they were overcome with lust and followed her to their doom. Nama, whose name means pleasant, was said to be so beautiful that even angels fell in love with her, and she used this beauty to corrupt both human and divine beings. Eesheth Zenonim, whose name means woman of whoredom, was the demon of prostitution and sexual corruption, turning women away from proper marriage and family life. Together, these 4 demon queens were said to divide the world among themselves, with each ruling over different territories and different types of sexual and reproductive corruption. But Lilith remained the greatest and most feared of them all, the one who had been there from the beginning, who had known Adam personally, who understood humanity's weaknesses better than any other demon, because she had once been human herself. The medieval texts also elaborated greatly on Lilith's reproductive activities. The alphabet of Ben Sira had mentioned that she would use men's seed to create demon children, but medieval authors provided much more detail about this process. According to these traditions, every time a man had an erotic dream or a nocturnal emission, Lilith was there, collecting his seed and using it to create more demons. These demon children were said to be born fully grown and immediately ready to join Lilith's armies in her war against humanity. This belief had profound practical implications for medieval Jewish men. It meant that any sexual activity outside of marriage, any erotic dream, any involuntary emission was potentially contributing to the forces of evil. It created a climate of sexual anxiety and guilt that would influence Jewish attitudes toward sexuality for centuries. Men were encouraged to marry young to avoid giving Lilith opportunities to steal their seed, and elaborate rituals were developed to protect against her nocturnal visits. The medieval period also saw the development of much more sophisticated protective measures against Lilith. While earlier traditions had relied mainly on the 3 angelic names and simple amulets, medieval Jewish communities developed elaborate systems of protection, involving multiple layers of defense. Houses would be protected with mezuzahs containing specific anti-Lilith formulas. Pregnant women would wear multiple amulets with different protective texts. Birth rooms would be surrounded with written prayers and divine names. Children would be given protective names or nicknames designed to confuse demons about their true identity. One particularly interesting development was the creation of what scholars call Lilith contracts, or divorce documents. These were formal legal documents, written in the style of Jewish divorce papers, that formally divorced Lilith from any claim on a particular man or family. The idea was that since Lilith had once been married to Adam, she might claim some sort of conjugal rights over his male descendants. By formally divorcing her, a man could legally protect himself from her advances. The medieval period also saw the development of elaborate calendars marking the times when Lilith was most dangerous. She was said to be particularly active during the new moon, when darkness was deepest. Certain days of the week were considered more dangerous than others. The period between sunset Friday and sunset Saturday, the Jewish Sabbath, was considered especially perilous because Lilith was said to be jealous of the joy and sanctity of Sabbath celebrations. But perhaps the most significant development in medieval Lilith traditions was the increasing emphasis on her role as a cosmic force, rather than just a personal threat. Earlier traditions had focused mainly on her attacks on individuals and families. Medieval texts began to portray her as a fundamental aspect of the structure of evil in the universe. She wasn't just a demon, she was the feminine principle of the demonic realm, the dark mirror of the divine feminine aspects of God. This cosmic role for Lilith was developed most fully in the early Kabbalistic texts that began appearing in the 12th and 13th centuries. These mystical works portrayed the universe as structured around a series of divine emanations called Sephirot, representing different aspects of God's nature and activity. But they also described a corresponding structure of evil emanations, called the Sitra Achra, or other side, which mirrored and opposed the divine structure. In this cosmic framework, Lilith wasn't just Samael's consort. She was the feminine aspect of the Sitra Achra itself, the queen of the entire realm of evil. She was portrayed as the dark counterpart to the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of God's presence in the world. Where the Shekinah represented divine love, compassion, and nurturing, Lilith represented hatred, cruelty, and destruction. Where the Shekinah sought to unite and heal, Lilith sought to divide and destroy. This cosmic role gave Lilith's activities a much broader significance. Her attacks on pregnant women weren't just personal vendettas, they were assaults on the divine plan for human reproduction. Her seduction of men wasn't just sexual predation, it was an attempt to corrupt the divine image in humanity. Her creation of demon children wasn't just revenge for her own losses. It was an effort to populate the world with beings opposed to God's will. The medieval expansion of Lilith traditions also included much more detailed descriptions of her ultimate fate. While earlier texts had focused on her current activities and how to protect against them, medieval authors began to speculate about what would happen to her in the end times. Some texts described a final battle between the forces of good and evil, in which Lilith would be definitively defeated and destroyed. Others suggested that she would eventually repent and be redeemed, returning to her original role as Adam's wife in a perfected world. These eschatological speculations about Lilith reflected broader medieval Jewish concerns about the ultimate triumph of good over evil and the eventual restoration of the world to its original perfected state. They also reflected the complex relationship between justice and mercy in Jewish theology. Lilith was clearly evil and deserved punishment, but she was also a victim of injustice who had been wronged by Adam's refusal to treat her as an equal. The medieval period also saw the development of much more elaborate artistic depictions of Lilith. While earlier traditions had provided only brief physical descriptions, medieval artists and writers created detailed portraits of her appearance and behavior. She was typically shown as a beautiful woman with long, flowing hair, often naked or scantily clothed, with wings and sometimes with bird feet or other animal characteristics. She might be shown strangling babies, seducing men, or ruling over her demon court. These artistic depictions served both to warn people about Lilith's dangers and to provide models for recognizing her when she appeared in disguise. They also reflected medieval attitudes about female beauty and sexuality, portraying Lilith as simultaneously attractive and dangerous, desirable and deadly. She embodied the medieval fear of uncontrolled female sexuality and the belief that women's beauty could be a trap leading men to spiritual destruction. As we trace the medieval expansion of Lilith traditions, we can see how a relatively simple story about a marital conflict in Eden grew into an elaborate mythology involving cosmic forces, mystical symbolism, and profound theological speculation. Each generation of medieval Jewish thinkers added new layers to the tradition, responding to their own concerns and anxieties while building on the foundation laid by earlier authors. But this expansion wasn't just academic or theoretical. These elaborate Lilith traditions had real practical effects on medieval Jewish life. They influenced how people understood sexuality, marriage, and family life. They shaped protective rituals and magical practices. They provided frameworks for understanding tragedy and suffering. They offered explanations for the inexplicable and tools for fighting the uncontrollable. As we move forward in our exploration of Lilith's evolution, we'll see how these medieval traditions would be further developed and systematized in the great works of Jewish mysticism, particularly the Zohar. The demon queen who emerged from medieval elaboration was about to become something even more cosmic and terrifying, a fundamental force in the mystical structure of the universe itself. The woman who had said no to Adam was about to become the eternal no that opposed God's yes to creation. In the hills of 13th century Spain, in the mystical circles of Girona, and later in the hidden academies of Castile, Jewish mystics were developing ideas that would revolutionize how people understood the very structure of reality itself. These were the early Kabbalists, and they weren't content with the traditional Jewish view of a universe where God was simply opposed by scattered demons and evil spirits. Instead, they envisioned a cosmos of breathtaking complexity, where divine light emanated through multiple levels of reality, where every aspect of existence had its corresponding spiritual dimension, and where even evil itself was organized into a systematic hierarchy that mirrored the structure of holiness. And at the heart of this mystical revolution, Lilith was about to undergo her most dramatic transformation yet, evolving from a demon queen into something far more cosmic and terrifying, the feminine face of absolute evil itself. To understand what the Kabbalists did to Lilith, we first need to understand their revolutionary vision of how the universe actually works. Traditional Jewish theology had always maintained that God was one, indivisible, and absolutely transcendent. But the Kabbalists asked a profound question. If God is infinite and perfect, how can finite, imperfect beings like humans possibly relate to the divine? Their answer was the doctrine of the Sephirot, 10 divine emanations or attributes through which the infinite God interacts with the created world. These Sephirot weren't separate gods or independent divine beings. They were aspects or faces of the one God, different ways that divine energy manifested itself in creation. They had names like wisdom, understanding, loving kindness, judgment, beauty, victory, splendor, foundation, and kingdom. They were arranged in a complex pattern called the Tree of Life, with channels of divine energy flowing between them in intricate patterns that the Kabbalists spent lifetimes trying to understand and map. But here's where the Kabbalistic vision becomes truly revolutionary, and where Lilith enters the picture in a completely new way. The early Kabbalists realized that if there were 10 holy Sephirot emanating divine light, there might also be corresponding emanations of darkness, a shadow structure that mirrored the divine tree, but inverted its values and purposes. They called this shadow structure the Sitra Achra, literally, the other side, and they populated it with its own hierarchy of evil beings that corresponded to and opposed each of the holy Sephirot. This wasn't just philosophical speculation. It was a complete reimagining of the nature of evil itself. Instead of seeing demons as random chaotic forces or as punishment for human sins, the Kabbalists understood evil as a systematic, organized cosmic principle that was built into the very structure of reality. Evil wasn't an accident or an aberration. It was a necessary part of the divine plan, serving purposes that humans couldn't fully understand, but that were somehow essential for the ultimate perfection of creation. And in this cosmic drama, Lilith was about to receive the starring role as the queen of the entire Sitra Achra, the feminine principle of cosmic evil, the dark bride who ruled over all the forces of darkness and destruction. But to understand how she achieved this exalted position in the hierarchy of evil, we need to look at one of the most important early Kabbalistic texts, a mysterious work called the Treatise on the Left Emanation, written sometime in the 13th century by an unknown author who may have been part of the mystical circle around the great Kabbalist, Isaac the Blind. The Treatise on the Left Emanation is a strange and disturbing work that reads like a demonic mirror image of traditional Kabbalistic texts about the Holy Sephirot. Where other texts describe the emanation of divine light and love, this treatise describes the emanation of darkness and hatred. Where other texts map the flow of blessing and life, this one charts the channels through which curse and death spread throughout creation. And at the center of this dark emanation, ruling as queen over the entire left side of creation, is Lilith. But this isn't the Lilith we've encountered before. This isn't Adam's rebellious first wife, or even the demon queen of medieval folklore. This is Lilith as a cosmic principle, as the very embodiment of the feminine aspect of evil. According to the treatise, she is the consort of Samael, who represents the masculine aspect of the Sitra Achra, and together they rule over a vast hierarchy of demons and evil spirits that extends throughout all levels of creation. The text describes Lilith as the woman of whoredom and the end of all flesh, titles that indicate her role as the corrupter of sexuality and the bringer of death. But she's also called the mother of demons and the queen of the left side, showing that she's not just a destroyer, but also a creator, albeit a creator of evil rather than good. In the Kabbalistic vision, Lilith doesn't just attack human families. She's actively working to create an alternative family structure, a demonic lineage that will eventually challenge and potentially overthrow the divine order itself. The treatise also provides a completely new origin story for Lilith that goes far beyond the Adam and Eve narrative. According to this text, Lilith emerged from the very process of creation itself, specifically from the divine attribute of judgment when it became separated from the moderating influence of mercy. In other words, Lilith represents what happens when divine justice becomes absolute and unmerciful, when the power to judge and punish is divorced from the power to forgive and heal. This origin story has profound theological implications. It suggests that Lilith isn't an accident or a mistake in creation. She's a necessary consequence of the way God chose to create the world. Divine justice is a necessary attribute, but when it operates without mercy, it becomes destructive rather than constructive. Lilith, in this reading, is the personification of justice without mercy, judgment without compassion, law without love. But the Kabbalistic transformation of Lilith goes even deeper than this. In the fully developed Kabbalistic system that would emerge in later centuries, Lilith becomes not just the queen of demons, but the dark mirror of the Shekinah, the feminine aspect of God's presence in the world. The Shekinah represents God's immanent presence, the divine light that dwells within creation and makes holiness possible in the physical world. Lilith, by contrast, represents the divine presence in exile, the feminine aspect of God that has been corrupted and turned against its original purpose. This parallel between Lilith and the Shekinah is one of the most sophisticated and disturbing aspects of Kabbalistic demonology. It suggests that the same divine energy that can manifest as the Shekinah's nurturing, protective, life-giving presence can also manifest as Lilith's destructive, seductive, death-dealing power. The difference isn't in the energy itself, but in how it's channeled and directed. When divine feminine energy flows through the proper channels of holiness, it becomes the Shekinah. When it flows through the channels of the Sitra Achra, it becomes Lilith. This understanding of Lilith had enormous implications for how Kabbalists understood sexuality, marriage, and family life. In their view, sexual energy was literally divine energy, a manifestation of the same creative force that God used to bring the universe into existence. But this meant that sexuality was also incredibly dangerous, because the same energy that could create holiness could also create its opposite. Every sexual act was a cosmic event that could either strengthen the forces of good or empower the forces of evil. According to Kabbalistic teaching, when a husband and wife came together in proper holiness with the right intentions and at the right times, their union actually strengthened the connection between the masculine and feminine aspects of God, helping to heal the cosmic rupture that had occurred at the beginning of creation. But when sexual energy was misdirected through adultery, prostitution, or even improper thoughts during marital relations, it fed the Sitra Achra and specifically empowered Lilith. This is why the Kabbalists developed such elaborate rules and rituals around sexuality. It wasn't just a matter of personal morality, it was cosmic warfare. Every erotic dream, every lustful thought, every sexual act outside of proper marriage was literally feeding the enemy. And the enemy had a face: Lilith, the dark queen who was constantly seeking to steal sexual energy and use it to strengthen her own power and create more demons to serve in her armies. The Kabbalistic texts describe Lilith as sexual predation in terms that are both more cosmic and more personal than earlier traditions. She doesn't just visit men in their dreams, she actually forms spiritual marriages with them, creating ongoing relationships that can last for years or even lifetimes. Men who are frequently visited by Lilith in their dreams are described as being married to her in the spiritual realm, and their earthly marriages suffer as a result because their sexual energy is being diverted to feed the forces of evil. But Lilith's cosmic role in Kabbalistic thought goes beyond sexuality. She's also understood as the force that prevents the ultimate redemption of the world. According to Kabbalistic theology, the goal of creation is the eventual reunification of all the scattered sparks of divine light, the healing of all cosmic ruptures, and the restoration of perfect harmony between all levels of reality. But Lilith actively works to prevent this redemption, seeking to maintain the current state of cosmic brokenness because it's the source of her power. In this understanding, Lilith becomes not just humanity's enemy, but God's enemy as well. She's not just rebelling against human authority, she's rebelling against the entire divine plan for creation. Her ultimate goal isn't just revenge against Adam, or even the destruction of humanity. It's the prevention of cosmic redemption itself. She wants to keep the world broken, divided, and imperfect, because that's the only way she can maintain her power and position. The Kabbalistic transformation of Lilith also involved a complete reimagining of her relationship with time and history. Earlier traditions had portrayed her as a figure from the distant past, who continued to cause problems in the present. But Kabbalistic texts describe her as an active participant in ongoing cosmic drama, a player in the great game of redemption and exile that defines all of history. According to these texts, Lilith's power waxes and wanes depending on the spiritual state of the world. When humanity is righteous and follows God's commandments, her power is weakened and constrained. But when humanity sins and turns away from God, her power grows stronger, and she becomes more active in her efforts to corrupt and destroy. This means that every human action has cosmic consequences, either strengthening the forces of holiness or empowering the forces of evil. The Kabbalists also developed elaborate theories about Lilith's ultimate fate in the Messianic age. Some texts suggest that she will be completely destroyed when the Messiah comes and the world is perfected. Others propose that she will be transformed and redeemed, returning to her original role as a positive feminine force in creation. Still others argue that she will continue to exist even in the perfected world, but in a controlled and limited way that serves the purposes of divine justice without threatening the overall harmony of creation. These eschatological speculations about Lilith reflect the broader Kabbalistic struggle to understand the role of evil in God's ultimate plan. If God is truly all-powerful and all-good, why does evil exist at all? And if evil serves some necessary purpose in the current world, what happens to it when that purpose is fulfilled? The various theories about Lilith's ultimate fate represent different attempts to answer these fundamental theological questions. The Kabbalistic transformation of Lilith also had profound practical implications for Jewish religious life. The elaborate protective rituals that had developed in earlier periods were now understood not just as ways to protect individual families, but as contributions to the cosmic battle between good and evil. Every amulet worn, every prayer recited, every precaution taken against Lilith was seen as a blow struck against the forces of darkness and a step toward the ultimate redemption of the world. This cosmic understanding of the struggle against Lilith also led to the development of new and more sophisticated protective practices. Kabbalistic texts describe elaborate meditative techniques for visualizing protective light around oneself and one's family. They provide complex formulas involving divine names and mystical symbols that were believed to have power over the entire Sitra Achra, not just individual demons. They develop theories about the proper times and methods for sexual relations that would minimize the risk of empowering Lilith, while maximizing the contribution to cosmic holiness. As we trace Lilith's evolution through the early Kabbalistic period, we can see how she was transformed from a figure of folklore and popular religion into a central element of sophisticated mystical theology. The Kabbalists didn't just accept the traditional stories about Lilith, they reimagined her as a cosmic principle, a fundamental aspect of the structure of reality itself. They made her not just a threat to be avoided, but a mystery to be understood, a problem to be solved, a cosmic puzzle whose solution was essential for understanding the nature of evil and the path to redemption. But this Kabbalistic transformation of Lilith was just the beginning. The ideas developed by the early Kabbalists would be further elaborated and systematized in the great masterwork of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, where Lilith would achieve her final and most terrifying form as the absolute queen of cosmic evil. The woman who had said no to Adam was about to become the eternal no that opposed every yes in creation, the dark feminine principle that sought to unmake the very foundations of reality itself. The other side had found its queen, and she was more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. In the candlelit study houses of 13th century Spain, a mysterious work was taking shape that would become the most influential text in all of Jewish mysticism. Its author claimed to be recording the ancient teachings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a 2nd century sage, but scholars today know it was actually written by Moses de Leon and his circle in medieval Castile. This was the Zohar, the Book of Splendor, and within its thousands of pages of mystical commentary on the Torah, Lilith would achieve her most complete and terrifying form. No longer just Adam's rebellious first wife, or even the queen of demons, she would become a cosmic force so fundamental to the structure of evil that the very fate of the universe would depend on humanity, his ability to resist her influence. The Zohar doesn't just mention Lilith in passing or tell a single story about her. Instead, it weaves her presence throughout its entire mystical system, making her an integral part of how the universe operates on every level, from the most exalted spiritual realms down to the most mundane details of daily life. In the Zoharic vision, Lilith isn't just a demon who attacks people. She's a fundamental principle of cosmic opposition, the dark feminine force that seeks to corrupt and destroy everything that God has created. But to understand what the Zohar does with Lilith, we need to first grasp the revolutionary cosmology that underlies the entire work. The Zohar presents a universe that's far more complex and dangerous than anything imagined in earlier Jewish texts. According to the Zohar, creation isn't a simple matter of God speaking the world into existence. Instead, it's an ongoing cosmic drama involving multiple levels of reality, competing forces of good and evil, and a constant struggle between the forces of unity and the forces of fragmentation. At the heart of this cosmic drama is what the Zohar calls the breaking of the vessels, a primordial catastrophe that occurred during the very process of creation itself. According to this teaching, when God first emanated divine light into creation, the spiritual vessels that were meant to contain that light were too fragile and shattered under its intensity. This cosmic catastrophe scattered sparks of divine light throughout all levels of reality, but it also created the possibility for evil to exist by providing spaces where divine light was absent or corrupted. And it's in these spaces of cosmic brokenness that Lilith makes her home. According to the Zohar, she didn't just rebel against Adam and leave Eden. She emerged from the very fractures in creation itself, feeding on the divine sparks that were scattered during the breaking of the vessels and using them to build her own alternative kingdom of darkness. She's not just opposed to humanity. She's opposed to the entire project of creation, seeking to prevent the repair of the cosmic catastrophe and maintain the current state of brokenness because that's the source of her power. The Zohar actually describes multiple Liliths, suggesting that she's not just a single being, but a principle that manifests in different forms at different levels of reality. There's the great Lilith, who rules over the highest levels of the demonic hierarchy, the lesser Lilith, who operates in the lower spiritual realms, and various other manifestations who specialize in different types of corruption and destruction. But all of these are understood to be aspects of a single cosmic principle, different faces of the same fundamental force of opposition to divine will. The most detailed description of Lilith in the Zohar comes in a passage that describes her relationship with Samael, the angel of death who serves as the masculine principle of the Sitra Achra. According to the text, Lilith and Samael are eternally joined in a cosmic marriage that mirrors and opposes the divine union between the masculine and feminine aspects of God. Where the divine union creates life, blessing, and harmony, the union between Lilith and Samael creates death, curse, and chaos. But this isn't just a static relationship. The Zohar describes the union between Lilith and Samael as an ongoing cosmic process that's constantly generating new forms of evil and corruption. Every time they come together, they create new demons, new diseases, new forms of spiritual pollution that spread throughout creation. And the frequency and intensity of their unions depends on human behavior. When humanity sins, when people turn away from God and violate divine commandments, They actually strengthen the bond between Lilith and Samael, making their cosmic marriage more fertile and more destructive. This teaching had profound implications for how the Zohar understood the relationship between human morality and cosmic order. It wasn't just that sin was bad for the individual sinner. It was that sin literally fed the forces of cosmic evil, making Lilith and Samael stronger and more capable of causing harm throughout creation. Every act of adultery, every moment of sexual impropriety, every violation of the laws governing family purity was understood as contributing to the power of the demonic couple and hastening the corruption of the world. The Zohar also provides the most detailed description we have of Lilith's appearance and behavior. She's described as incredibly beautiful, more beautiful than any human woman, with long flowing hair that contains all the colors of the rainbow. But this beauty is deceptive and dangerous. Her hair, which appears so lovely, is actually made of serpents that can strike and poison anyone who comes too close. Her eyes, which seem so alluring, can hypnotize and control anyone who looks into them. Her voice, which sounds so sweet, can drive listeners to madness or death. But perhaps most disturbing of all, the Zohar describes Lilith as having the ability to appear as any woman. She can take the form of a man's wife, his mother, his daughter, or any other woman he knows and trusts. This shape-shifting ability makes her incredibly dangerous, because it means that men can never be certain whether the woman they're interacting with is really who she appears to be, or is actually Lilith in disguise. This teaching created a climate of suspicion and anxiety around female sexuality that would influence Jewish attitudes for centuries. The Zohar also elaborates greatly on Lilith's reproductive activities, providing much more detail than earlier texts about how she creates her demon offspring. According to the Zohar, Lilith doesn't just steal men's seed during nocturnal emissions. She actually forms ongoing spiritual relationships with men, becoming their invisible concubine and bearing them demon children that they never see, but that nevertheless exist in the spiritual realm. These demon children are described as being born fully grown and immediately ready to serve in Lilith's armies. They're not random, chaotic forces, but organized soldiers in the cosmic war against divine order. Some specialize in causing diseases, others in promoting sexual immorality, still others in preventing human reproduction or corrupting human children. The Zohar suggests that these demon armies are constantly growing, fed by human sin and sexual impropriety, and that they represent an existential threat to the continuation of human civilization. But the Zohar's treatment of Lilith goes beyond just describing her current activities. It also provides elaborate theories about her role in biblical history and her ongoing influence on major historical events. According to the Zohar, Lilith was present at many of the crucial moments in biblical narrative, always working behind the scenes to corrupt and destroy God's plans for humanity. For example, the Zohar suggests that Lilith was the real power behind the serpent in the Garden of Eden. While the serpent provided the physical form, it was Lilith who provided the intelligence and malice that led to Adam and Eve's fall. This teaching makes Lilith responsible not just for her own rebellion, but for the introduction of sin and death into the world. She's not just a victim of cosmic injustice, she's the primary agent of cosmic corruption. The Zohar also describes Lilith's role in the story of Cain and Abel. According to this text, after Abel's death, Adam separated from Eve for 130 years, and during this period, Lilith visited him regularly, bearing him demon children who would become the ancestors of all the evil spirits that plague humanity. This teaching explains not just the origin of demons, but also the source of the violence and corruption that characterizes human history. Every war, every murder, every act of cruelty can be traced back to the demon children that Lilith bore to Adam during his separation from Eve. Perhaps most dramatically, the Zohar describes Lilith's presence at Mount Sinai during the giving of the Torah. According to this text, when God revealed the divine law to the Israelites, Lilith was there too, working to corrupt and distort the divine message. She whispered alternative interpretations into people's ears, planted doubts about God's intentions, and tried to prevent the Israelites from accepting the Torah. The Zohar suggests that every misunderstanding of divine law, every heretical interpretation, every corruption of religious teaching can be traced back to Lilith's influence at Sinai. But the Zohar doesn't just describe Lilith's past activities. It also provides detailed prophecies about her role in the end times. According to these texts, as the world approaches the Messianic age, Lilith's power will actually increase rather than decrease. She will become more desperate and more dangerous as she realizes that her time is running out, and she will launch increasingly violent attacks against humanity in an attempt to prevent the final redemption. The Zohar describes a final cosmic battle between Lilith and the forces of holiness that will determine the ultimate fate of creation. In this battle, Lilith will marshal all of her demon armies, all of her accumulated power from centuries of human sin, all of her cosmic rage against divine order. She will attempt to corrupt the Messiah himself, to prevent the resurrection of the dead, to stop the final repair of the broken vessels, and the restoration of cosmic harmony. But according to the Zohar, this final battle will also be Lilith's ultimate defeat. The text describes how God will finally reveal the full extent of divine power, how the accumulated merit of righteous human actions throughout history will provide the energy needed to overcome the forces of evil, and how Lilith herself will be either destroyed completely or transformed into a force for good. Different passages in the Zohar provide different versions of this final resolution, but all agree that Lilith's current reign of terror will eventually come to an end. The Zohar also provides the most sophisticated analysis we have of the psychological and spiritual mechanisms through which Lilith operates. According to these texts, she doesn't just attack people from the outside. She works by awakening and amplifying the evil impulses that already exist within human hearts. She's particularly skilled at exploiting sexual desire, turning natural and healthy impulses into destructive obsessions that separate people from God and from each other. The Zohar describes how Lilith studies each individual person, learning their particular weaknesses and vulnerabilities, and then crafts specific temptations designed to exploit those weaknesses. She might appear to a lonely man as the perfect companion, to an ambitious woman as the key to power and success, to a grieving parent as the promise of reunion with a dead child. In each case, she offers something that the person desperately wants, but in a way that will ultimately destroy them. This psychological sophistication makes Lilith far more dangerous than a simple demon who relies on brute force or obvious temptation. She's portrayed as a master manipulator who understands human nature better than humans understand themselves. She can wait patiently for years or even decades, slowly building relationships and trust, before finally revealing her true nature and claiming her victims. The Zohar also describes the various methods that can be used to protect against Lilith's influence. But these methods are far more complex and demanding than the simple amulets and prayers described in earlier texts. According to the Zohar, truly effective protection against Lilith requires a complete transformation of consciousness, a fundamental reorientation of one's entire spiritual life toward divine service and away from selfish desire. The text describes elaborate meditative practices designed to strengthen the soul's connection to divine light and make it impossible for Lilith to find any foothold for her influence. It provides complex formulas involving divine names and mystical symbols that can create protective barriers around individuals and communities. It outlines detailed rules for sexual conduct that can prevent Lilith from stealing sexual energy and using it to create demon offspring. But perhaps most importantly, the Zohar emphasizes that the ultimate protection against Lilith comes not from external defenses, but from internal transformation. According to these teachings, Lilith can only influence people who have some element of spiritual darkness within themselves, some area where they're not fully aligned with divine will. The only way to be completely safe from her influence is to achieve a state of perfect righteousness, complete devotion to God, and total elimination of selfish desire. This teaching made the struggle against Lilith not just a matter of personal protection, but a fundamental aspect of spiritual development. Every person who sought to grow closer to God had to confront and overcome Lilith's influence. Every community that wanted to create a space of holiness had to develop effective methods for keeping her at bay. Every generation had to take up the cosmic battle against the forces of evil that she represented. As we trace Lilith's development through the Zohar, we can see how she achieved her final and most complete form as a cosmic principle of evil. The Zohar transformed her from a figure of folklore into a fundamental aspect of mystical theology, from a personal threat into a cosmic force, from a character in ancient stories into an ongoing reality that every person had to confront in their spiritual life. But the Zohar's treatment of Lilith also reveals the deep anxieties and fears that characterized medieval Jewish life. The elaborate descriptions of her powers and activities reflect real concerns about sexuality, family life, and spiritual corruption. The complex protective measures described in the text show how seriously these communities took the threat of evil and how much effort they were willing to invest in fighting against it. The Zohar's Lilith is the culmination of over 2,000 years of tradition, the final synthesis of all the fears, stories, and beliefs that had accumulated around this figure since her first mention in Isaiah. She had traveled from being a desert demon to Adam's first wife, to the queen of all demons, and now she had achieved her ultimate form as the cosmic principle of opposition to divine will itself. The woman who had said no to Adam had become the eternal no that opposed every aspect of God's yes to creation. But even this wasn't the end of Lilith's story. The Zoharic tradition would continue to develop and elaborate, and Lilith would continue to evolve, taking on new forms and new meanings as Jewish communities faced new challenges and new fears. The cosmic demon queen was about to encounter the modern world, and that encounter would transform her yet again in ways that her ancient creators could never have imagined. Picture a young Jewish woman in 16th century Prague, heavy with her first child, lying awake in the darkness as her labor pains begin. Around her neck hangs a carefully crafted amulet, inscribed with Hebrew letters that seem to glow in the candlelight. Pinned to the walls of her birth chamber are sheets of parchment covered with mystical formulas, divine names, and crude drawings of bound demons. Above her bed, 3 names are written in bold letters: Sinoi, Sansanoi, and Samangeloff. And in the corner of the room, her mother whispers ancient prayers that have been passed down through generations of Jewish women, prayers specifically designed to keep Lilith away from mothers and newborn babies. This scene, repeated countless times across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, represents one of the most persistent and widespread magical traditions in Jewish history. The use of amulets and protective rituals to defend against Lilith's attacks. What makes the amulet tradition so fascinating is how it bridges the gap between the elaborate theological speculations we've been discussing and the practical, everyday fears of ordinary people. While rabbis and mystics were developing complex theories about Lilith's cosmic role, Jewish families were dealing with the immediate, practical problem of how to protect their most vulnerable members from her attacks. The result was a rich tradition of protective magic that combined sophisticated theological concepts with folk wisdom, biblical quotations with magical formulas, and ancient traditions with contemporary innovations. The amulets themselves are remarkable artifacts that tell us an enormous amount about how people actually understood and feared Lilith. Most were written on parchment or paper, though some were engraved on metal plates or carved into wood or stone. They typically combined several different types of protective elements: biblical verses that were believed to have special power against demons, divine names that could compel obedience from evil spirits, the names of protective angels who had authority over Lilith, and specific formulas that bound her through the oath she had sworn to the 3 angels. One particularly well-preserved amulet from 17th century Italy, now housed in the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, provides a perfect example of how these protective texts worked. The amulet begins with a quotation from Psalm 121. "The Lord will guard you from all evil. He will guard your soul." This isn't just a general prayer for protection. It's specifically chosen because the Hebrew word for evil, ra, was understood to include demonic forces, and the promise that God will guard your soul was interpreted as protection against spiritual attacks. The amulet then continues with the names of the three angels, in the name of Senoi, Sansanoi, and Samangeloth, who have power over Lilith and all her kinds. This invocation isn't just asking for the angels' help. It's actually commanding Lilith to obey the oath she swore to these angels centuries ago. The amulet is essentially serving her with a legal document, reminding her of her binding promise and threatening her with the consequences if she violates it. But the amulet doesn't stop there. It continues with an elaborate formula that describes exactly what Lilith is forbidden to do. You shall not harm this child neither in sleep nor in waking, neither in eating nor in drinking, neither in his body nor in his soul, neither by day nor by night. This comprehensive list isn't accidental. It's designed to close every possible loophole that Lilith might try to exploit. The amulet writers had clearly thought carefully about all the different ways that Lilith might attack a child, and were determined to protect against every possibility. The amulet concludes with a direct threat to Lilith herself, and if you do not obey this command, then may you be bound with chains of iron and cast into the depths of the sea until the coming of the Messiah. This isn't just a prayer or a hope. It's presented as a binding legal consequence that will automatically take effect if Lilith violates the terms of the protection. The amulet writers understood that they were engaged in a form of spiritual contract law, and they wanted to make sure the terms were absolutely clear. What's particularly fascinating about these amulets is how they reveal the geographic spread and cultural adaptation of Lilith beliefs. Amulets have been found in Jewish communities from Yemen to Poland, from Morocco to Iran, and while they all share certain basic elements, they also show remarkable local variation. Sephardic amulets from Spain and North Africa often include Arabic magical formulas alongside Hebrew text, reflecting the multicultural environment in which these communities lived. Ashkenazi amulets from Eastern Europe sometimes incorporate elements from Christian protective magic, showing how Jewish communities adapted to their local contexts while maintaining their distinctive traditions. The timing of amulet use also reveals important information about when Lilith was considered most dangerous. The vast majority of surviving amulets were designed to protect pregnant women and newborn babies, particularly during the first 40 days after birth when children were considered most vulnerable. But amulets were also used to protect young men, especially during the period between puberty and marriage, when they were most susceptible to Lilith's sexual attacks. Some amulets were designed for specific occasions, such as weddings, circumcisions, or times of illness when spiritual defenses might be weakened. The visual elements of these amulets are just as important as the text. Many include crude but powerful drawings of Lilith herself, typically shown as a woman with long hair, wings, and sometimes bird feet or other demonic characteristics. But these aren't just illustrations. They're magical images designed to bind and control her. By depicting Lilith in chains or surrounded by protective symbols, the amulet makers believed they could actually constrain her power and prevent her from acting against the amulet's bearer. Some amulets also include images of the three protective angels, typically shown as warrior figures with swords or other weapons, ready to defend against demonic attack. These images served both to invoke the angels' protection and to remind Lilith of the forces arrayed against her. The visual message was clear. This child or family was under divine protection, and any attack would be met with overwhelming angelic force. The production of these amulets was often a community affair involving multiple specialists. The text might be written by a learned scribe who knew the proper formulas and could write in the sacred Hebrew script. The parchment might be prepared by someone who knew the ritual requirements for creating sacred objects. The final blessing and activation of the amulet might be performed by a rabbi or other religious authority. This collaborative process ensured that the amulets met the highest standards of both magical effectiveness and religious legitimacy. But the amulet tradition wasn't just about individual protection. It was also about community solidarity and mutual support. When a woman was preparing for childbirth, other women in the community would often contribute to the cost of commissioning protective amulets. Experienced mothers would share their knowledge of effective formulas and protective practices. The entire community would participate in the rituals designed to create a protective environment around the mother and child. The economic aspects of the amulet tradition also tell us something important about how seriously these protections were taken. Commissioning a properly made amulet could be expensive, requiring payment to scribes, the purchase of high-quality materials, and sometimes the addition of precious metals or gems for enhanced protection. Yet families regularly made these investments, often at considerable financial sacrifice, because they believed their children's lives depended on it. The rabbinic response to the amulet tradition was complex and often contradictory. Some rabbis condemned the use of amulets as superstition and a violation of the prohibition against magic. Others permitted or even encouraged their use, arguing that protection against demons was a legitimate religious practice. Still others took a middle position, allowing amulets that contained only biblical verses and divine names, while forbidding those that included magical formulas or images. This rabbinic ambivalence reflects a broader tension in Jewish law between the desire to maintain rational monotheistic theology and the need to address the real fears and concerns of ordinary people. The rabbis couldn't simply dismiss beliefs about Lilith that were so widespread and deeply held, but they also couldn't fully endorse practices that seemed to compromise Jewish monotheism by treating demons as independent powers. The solution that many rabbinic authorities adopted was to regulate rather than prohibit the amulet tradition. They established guidelines for what kinds of protective texts were permissible, which divine names could be used, and how amulets should be prepared and activated. They insisted that all protection ultimately came from God rather than from the amulets themselves, and they required that amulet users maintain their regular religious observances rather than relying solely on magical protection. The amulet tradition also evolved over time in response to changing circumstances and new threats. During periods of persecution or social upheaval, when infant mortality rates were particularly high, the demand for protective amulets increased dramatically. During times of relative peace and prosperity, the tradition might become more standardized and less urgent. New formulas and techniques were constantly being developed and tested, with successful innovations spreading rapidly through Jewish communities. One particularly interesting development was the creation of what scholars call master amulets, or mother amulets, comprehensive protective texts that were designed to provide protection against not just Lilith, but against all forms of demonic attack. These elaborate documents might contain dozens of different protective formulas, hundreds of divine names, and complex diagrams showing the relationships between different spiritual forces. They were typically kept in synagogues or community centers, and consulted when families needed specific protection against particular threats. The amulet tradition also shows how Jewish communities maintained their religious identity while adapting to local conditions. Jewish amulets from Islamic countries often incorporated Arabic script and Islamic protective formulas alongside traditional Hebrew elements. Jewish amulets from Christian Europe sometimes included Latin phrases or Christian symbols, though always in subordinate positions to the Hebrew text. This syncretistic approach allowed Jewish communities to benefit from local protective traditions while maintaining their distinctive religious identity. The gender dynamics of the amulet tradition are also worth noting. While the texts were typically written by male scribes and rabbis, the actual use and transmission of amulet traditions was largely in the hands of women. Mothers taught daughters which amulets were most effective, how to activate them properly, and when they should be used. Midwives and other women who assisted at births were often experts in protective magic, knowing dozens of different formulas and techniques for keeping Lilith at bay. This female expertise in anti-Lilith magic created an interesting paradox. Women were simultaneously the primary victims of Lilith's attacks and the primary defenders against those attacks. They were the ones most at risk during pregnancy and childbirth, but they were also the ones who developed and maintained the most effective protective measures. In a sense, the amulet tradition represented a form of female resistance against female oppression, with women using their knowledge and skills to protect themselves and their children against a supernatural threat that specifically targeted them. The amulet tradition also reveals the international nature of Jewish culture during the medieval and early modern periods. Protective formulas developed in one community would spread rapidly to others through trade networks, scholarly correspondence, and family connections. A particularly effective amulet formula might originate in Baghdad, be refined in Cairo, and end up being used by Jewish families in Prague or Amsterdam. This constant exchange of ideas and techniques ensured that the most effective protective measures were available to Jewish communities worldwide. As we study these amulets today, we need to remember that they represent real fear, real hope, and real love. The families who commissioned them weren't engaging in abstract theological speculation. They were trying to protect their most precious possessions using every tool available to them. In a world where infant mortality was high, where childbirth was dangerous, and where unexplained deaths were common, these amulets provided both practical protection and psychological comfort. The amulet tradition also shows how religious communities adapt ancient beliefs to contemporary needs. The basic story of Lilith and the three angels remained constant across centuries and continents, but the specific applications and interpretations of that story were constantly evolving in response to new circumstances and new understanding. Each generation found new ways to apply ancient wisdom to contemporary problems. But perhaps most importantly, the amulet tradition demonstrates the persistence and power of the Lilith legend. For over 1,000 years, Jewish families across the world continued to fear her attacks and seek protection against them. They invested time, money, and emotional energy in elaborate protective rituals because they believed that Lilith was real, dangerous, and actively seeking to harm them and their children. As we move toward the end of our exploration of Lilith's evolution, the amulet tradition reminds us that this wasn't just an academic or literary phenomenon. Lilith lived in the daily experience of countless families, shaped their most intimate moments, and influenced their most important decisions. She was present at births and deaths, at weddings and circumcisions, at moments of joy and times of terror. The woman who had said no to Adam had become a permanent presence in Jewish life, feared and fought against, but never forgotten, never dismissed, never defeated. The amulets were humanity's attempt to say no back to her, to draw lines she couldn't cross, to create spaces where families could be safe from her influence. And for many families, for many generations, those protective barriers held. But Lilith was patient, and she was persistent, and she was always looking for new ways to break through the defenses that humans erected against her. The war between Lilith and humanity was far from over, and the next battlefield would be the modern world itself. By the 15th and 16th centuries, something remarkable was happening to the story of Lilith across the Jewish world. What had begun as scattered references in ancient texts and developed through centuries of mystical speculation was now crystallizing into a comprehensive mythology that attempted to answer every possible question about her nature, origins, and activities. Jewish scholars and storytellers from Italy to Poland, from Morocco to Yemen, were creating elaborate compilations that brought together all the various Lilith traditions into unified narratives. These weren't just academic exercises or theological treatises. They were attempts to create definitive guides to understanding and dealing with one of the most feared figures in Jewish demonology. The most important of these synthetic works was a text called the Midrash Talpiot, compiled by the Italian rabbi Elijah ben Abraham Mizrachi in the early 16th century. Unlike earlier texts that mentioned Lilith in passing or focused on specific aspects of her story, the Midrash Talpiot attempted to provide a complete biography of Lilith from her creation in Eden to her ultimate fate in the Messianic age. It drew on sources ranging from the Talmud to the Zohar, from ancient incantation bowls to contemporary amulet traditions, weaving them together into a narrative that was both comprehensive and terrifying. According to the Midrash Talpiot, Lilith's story began even before her creation as Adam's first wife. The text describes how God, in planning the creation of humanity, foresaw that human beings would need to confront and overcome evil in order to achieve their spiritual potential. Therefore, God deliberately created Lilith as a test and a challenge, a being who would embody all the temptations and dangers that humans would need to resist in order to fulfill their divine purpose. This origin story transforms Lilith from a tragic figure who was wronged by Adam into a deliberate instrument of divine testing. She wasn't created to be Adam's equal partner. She was created to challenge him, to force him to choose between easy pleasure and difficult righteousness. When Adam failed this test by insisting on his dominance rather than treating her as an equal, he set in motion a chain of events that would plague humanity for all subsequent generations. The Midrash Talpiot also provides the most detailed description we have of Lilith's physical appearance and supernatural abilities. According to this text, she was created with beauty that surpassed even that of the angels, with hair that contained all the colors of creation and eyes that reflected the light of the divine throne. But this beauty was deceptive, designed to attract and ensnare rather than to inspire genuine love. Beneath her beautiful exterior, she possessed the strength of 1,000 men, the speed of the wind, and the cunning of the serpent who would later tempt Eve. The text describes how Lilith could transform herself into any shape she desired, appearing sometimes as a young maiden, sometimes as a mature woman, sometimes as an elderly crone, depending on what would be most effective for her purposes. She could become invisible at will, pass through solid walls, and travel instantly across vast distances. She could speak any language, imitate any voice, and even read human thoughts and desires. These abilities made her the perfect predator, capable of adapting to any situation and exploiting any weakness. But the Midrash Talpiot doesn't just describe Lilith's individual powers. It also provides elaborate details about her kingdom and her subjects. According to this text, after leaving Eden, Lilith established her realm in a place called the Desert of Screaming, located somewhere beyond the edge of the inhabited world. This wasn't just a barren wasteland, it was a vast kingdom with cities, palaces, and armies, all dedicated to the corruption and destruction of humanity. The text describes Lilith's palace as a magnificent structure built from black marble and decorated with precious stones that had been stolen from the divine throne room. The palace had 480 rooms, each one dedicated to a different type of evil activity. There were rooms where demons planned attacks on human families, rooms where new forms of disease and suffering were devised, rooms where the souls of the wicked were tortured, and rooms where Lilith herself held court and received reports from her agents throughout the world. The Midrash Talpiot also provides detailed information about Lilith's demon armies and their organization. According to this text, she commanded 480 legions of demons, each legion containing 1,000 individual spirits. These weren't random, chaotic forces. They were highly organized military units with specific ranks, responsibilities, and areas of expertise. Some legions specialized in attacking pregnant women, others in seducing men, still others in causing nightmares, diseases, or natural disasters. Each legion was commanded by a demon prince who reported directly to Lilith, and who had been given authority over specific geographic regions or demographic groups. There were demon princes who specialized in attacking scholars, others who focused on merchants, still others who targeted children or the elderly. This systematic approach to evil made Lilith's forces far more effective than random demonic attacks could ever be. The text also describes the daily routine of Lilith's kingdom, providing a glimpse into how the forces of evil organized their activities. Every morning, Lilith would hold court and receive reports from her agents about their activities during the previous night. She would review plans for upcoming attacks, assign new targets to her demon legions, and coordinate her activities with other forces of evil throughout the cosmos. According to the Midrash Talpiot, Lilith maintained extensive intelligence networks that kept her informed about human activities throughout the world. She had spies in every community, informants in every family, and agents who could report on the spiritual condition of every individual. This information allowed her to target her attacks with devastating precision, striking at people when they were most vulnerable and exploiting their specific weaknesses and fears. The text also provides elaborate details about Lilith's reproductive activities and the creation of her demon offspring. According to this account, Lilith didn't just steal men's seed during nocturnal emissions. She maintained ongoing relationships with thousands of men simultaneously, visiting each one regularly and bearing demon children at an incredible rate. These demon children were born fully grown and immediately inducted into her armies, ensuring that her forces were constantly growing stronger. But the Midrash Talpiot also describes the terrible price that Lilith paid for her rebellion. The text elaborates on the curse pronounced by the three angels, explaining that the daily death of 100 of her children wasn't just a punishment, but a cosmic necessity. According to this interpretation, Lilith's demon children represented pure evil, and their existence threatened the very foundations of creation. The daily deaths served to prevent her armies from growing so large that they could overwhelm the forces of good entirely. The text describes Lilith's daily grief as she watched her children die, portraying her as a tragic figure caught between her desire for revenge and her maternal love for her offspring. Every morning she would count the bodies of the demons who had died during the night, and every evening she would mourn their loss while simultaneously planning new attacks against humanity. This cycle of loss and revenge had continued for thousands of years and would continue until the end of time. Another important synthetic work from this period was the Yalkut Reubeni, compiled by the Safed Kabbalist Reuben Hoshki in the late 16th century. This text focused particularly on the mystical and cosmic aspects of Lilith's story, drawing heavily on Zoharic traditions while adding new interpretations and elaborations. According to the Yalkut Reubeni, Lilith wasn't just a demon queen but a fundamental force in the cosmic structure of reality itself. The text describes how Lilith's rebellion against Adam created a permanent rupture in the fabric of creation, a cosmic wound that could never fully heal as long as she remained in rebellion against divine order. This rupture allowed evil to enter the world and gave demons and other malevolent forces a foothold in creation. Every sin committed by human beings widened this cosmic wound, making it easier for evil to spread and more difficult for good to triumph. According to the Yalkut Reubeni, the ultimate goal of Lilith's activities wasn't just revenge against Adam and his descendants, but the complete destruction of creation itself. She sought to undo the work of the 6 days of creation, returning the universe to the primordial chaos that existed before God spoke the world into being. Her attacks on human families weren't just personal vendettas. They were part of a systematic campaign to prevent human reproduction and ultimately cause the extinction of the human race. The text also provides detailed descriptions of the cosmic battles between Lilith and the forces of good that occur on spiritual levels invisible to ordinary human perception. According to this account, every human action, every prayer, every good deed or sin contributes to one side or the other in this ongoing cosmic war. When humans act righteously, they strengthen the forces of good and weaken Lilith's power. When they sin, they feed the forces of evil and make Lilith stronger. Perhaps the most elaborate of all the medieval synthetic works was the Emek HaMelech, Valley of the King, written by the German Kabbalist Naphtali Herz ben Jacob Elhanan Bacharach in the mid-17th century. This massive work attempted to provide a complete systematic theology of evil, with Lilith as the central figure in an elaborate cosmic drama involving multiple levels of reality and countless spiritual beings. According to the Emek HaMelech, Lilith existed in multiple forms simultaneously across different levels of creation. There was the historical Lilith who had been Adam's first wife, the cosmic Lilith who served as the feminine principle of the Sitra Achra, the psychological Lilith who represented the evil impulse within every human heart, and the eschatological Lilith who would play a crucial role in the events of the end times. The text describes how these different aspects of Lilith were all connected, and how they worked together to corrupt and destroy human souls. The historical Lilith provided the narrative framework and emotional motivation for the attacks. The cosmic Lilith provided the power and authority to carry out those attacks. The psychological Lilith provided the internal weaknesses that made humans vulnerable to temptation. And the eschatological Lilith represented the ultimate threat that humanity would have to overcome in order to achieve final redemption. The Emek HaMelech also provides the most detailed account we have of Lilith's ultimate fate in the Messianic age. According to this text, when the Messiah comes and the world is perfected, Lilith will face a final choice. She can repent of her rebellion and be restored to her original role as Adam's wife in a perfected Eden, or she can persist in her evil and be destroyed completely. The text suggests that this choice will be genuinely difficult for her, because repentance would require her to acknowledge that her rebellion was wrong and to accept the subordinate position she had originally rejected. These medieval synthetic works represent the culmination of over a millennium of Lilith tradition. They brought together all the various strands of her mythology into comprehensive narratives that attempted to answer every possible question about her nature and activities. They transformed her from a figure of folklore into a systematic theological principle, from a character in ancient stories into a fundamental aspect of how the universe operates. But these texts also reveal the deep anxieties and fears that characterized medieval Jewish life. The elaborate descriptions of Lilith's powers and activities reflect real concerns about sexuality, family life, and spiritual corruption. The complex protective measures described in these texts show how seriously these communities took the threat of evil, and how much effort they were willing to invest in fighting against it. The medieval synthesis of Lilith traditions also had profound practical implications for Jewish religious life. These texts provided the theological framework for the elaborate protective rituals that we discussed earlier. They explained why certain amulets were effective and others weren't. They provided the rationale for complex rules governing sexual conduct and family purity. They offered explanations for tragedy and suffering that allowed people to maintain their faith in divine justice, even in the face of inexplicable loss. As we trace the development of these synthetic traditions, we can see how Lilith evolved from a simple demon into a complex theological principle that addressed some of the most fundamental questions of human existence. Why does evil exist? Why do good people suffer? Why is sexuality both creative and destructive? Why do children die? Why do families break apart? The elaborate Lilith mythology provided answers to all of these questions, even if those answers were often disturbing and frightening. The medieval synthesis also shows how religious traditions adapt and evolve in response to changing circumstances and new challenges. Each generation of Jewish thinkers found new ways to interpret and apply the ancient Lilith traditions to their contemporary concerns. They added new details, developed new interpretations, and created new applications while maintaining continuity with the fundamental narrative framework that had been established centuries earlier. But perhaps most importantly, these medieval synthetic works demonstrate the enduring power and relevance of the Lilith legend. For over 1,000 years, Jewish communities had continued to find her story compelling, frightening, and meaningful. They had invested enormous intellectual and creative energy in developing and elaborating her mythology because they believed it helped them understand and cope with the fundamental challenges of human existence. The woman who had said no to Adam had become a lens through which entire communities understood the nature of evil, the challenges of family life, and the cosmic struggle between good and evil. She had evolved from a minor character in ancient folklore into a major figure in systematic theology, and as we'll see in our final section, her influence would extend far beyond the Jewish communities that created her, shaping broader cultural understanding of female power, sexual danger, and cosmic rebellion for centuries to come. The medieval synthesis was complete. Lilith had achieved her final form as a comprehensive mythological figure who could explain everything from personal nightmares to cosmic catastrophes. But her story was far from over. The modern world was coming, and it would find new uses for the ancient demon queen, new meanings in her eternal rebellion, and new relevance in her refusal to submit to anyone's authority but her own. As we've traced Lilith's evolution from ancient Mesopotamian wind demon to medieval cosmic queen, you might have wondered, was she unique? Was she the only female demon who terrorized ancient and medieval communities with attacks on families, children, and sexual relationships? The answer is both fascinating and disturbing. Lilith was part of a vast sisterhood of similar demons that appeared across cultures and centuries, suggesting that the fears she represented were universal human concerns that transcended any single religious or cultural tradition. Understanding these parallel traditions helps us see what made Lilith special, while also revealing the deep psychological and social anxieties that gave birth to an entire category of child-killing, man-seducing, family-destroying female demons. Let's start with Lilith's closest sisters within Jewish tradition itself, because even as her own mythology was developing, Jewish texts were describing other female demons with remarkably similar characteristics and behaviors. The most important of these sister demons were Agrat bat Mahlat, Nama, and Isheth Zenunim, who together with Lilith formed what medieval Jewish texts called the Four Mothers of Demons, or the Four Queens of the Sitra Achra. These weren't just random evil spirits. They were portrayed as an organized sisterhood that had divided the world among themselves, each ruling over different territories and specializing in different types of corruption and destruction. Agrat bat Mahlat, whose name means the daughter of Mahlat, or possibly the daughter of dancing, was described as the demon who ruled over Wednesday nights and who specialized in seducing men through dance and music. According to Talmudic sources, she commanded 180,000 demons and traveled the world in a great chariot, accompanied by 18 different types of destructive spirits. But what made her particularly dangerous was her beauty and her skill as a performer. She would appear on rooftops and balconies, dancing seductively until men became so entranced that they would follow her to their doom. The parallels with Lilith are obvious. Both were beautiful female demons who used their sexuality to destroy men. Both commanded vast armies of lesser demons. Both were associated with specific times when they were most dangerous. But Agrat bat Mahlat had her own distinctive characteristics that made her a unique threat. Where Lilith attacked through dreams and nocturnal visits, Agrat bat Mahlat operated in the liminal spaces of the built environment, on rooftops and thresholds, in doorways and windows, places where the boundary between inside and outside, safety and danger, was most permeable. Nama, whose name means pleasant or beautiful, was described as the demon of prostitution and sexual corruption. According to Jewish tradition, she was the sister of Tubal-Cain, mentioned briefly in Genesis as one of the descendants of Cain, but medieval texts transformed her into a powerful demon who specialized in corrupting human sexuality. She was said to be so beautiful that even angels fell in love with her, and she used this beauty to lead both human and divine beings away from their proper spiritual paths. What made Nama particularly dangerous was her ability to make sin seem pleasant and natural. Where Lilith often operated through force and terror, Nama worked through seduction and persuasion. She would appear to men as the perfect woman, offering them everything they thought they wanted, but always in ways that would ultimately destroy their relationships with their wives, their families, and their God. She represented the danger of sexuality that seemed consensual and enjoyable, but was actually corrupting and destructive. Isheth Zenunim, whose name literally means woman of whoredom, was the most explicitly sexual of Lilith's sister demons. She was described as the demon who ruled over Friday nights and who specialized in corrupting the sexual relationships between husbands and wives. According to medieval texts, she would appear to married couples during their intimate moments, whispering suggestions that would turn holy sexual union into something selfish and corrupting. What's particularly interesting about Isheth Zenunim is how she represents the fear that even legitimate sexuality could become dangerous if it wasn't properly controlled and sanctified. She didn't just attack unmarried people, or those engaged in obviously sinful behavior. She targeted the most sacred sexual relationships, trying to corrupt them from within. This reflects the deep anxiety in medieval Jewish culture about the power of sexuality and the constant vigilance required to keep it within proper bounds. Together, these 4 demon queens were said to rule over different aspects of human sexuality and reproduction, with each having her own territory, her own methods, and her own specialties. But they also worked together, coordinating their attacks and sharing information about vulnerable targets. Medieval texts describe regular meetings between them where they would plan joint operations and divide up new territories for corruption. But Jewish tradition wasn't the only culture that developed elaborate mythologies around child-killing, man-seducing female demons. Across the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world, we find remarkably similar figures that suggest these fears were universal human concerns rather than unique Jewish anxieties. The Greek tradition of Lamia provides perhaps the closest parallel to Lilith, and the similarities are so striking that some scholars argue for direct historical connections between the two traditions. According to Greek mythology, Lamia was originally a beautiful queen of Libya who became the lover of Zeus, the king of the gods. But when Zeus's jealous wife Hera discovered the affair, she killed all of Lamia's children and transformed her into a monster. Driven mad by grief and rage, Lamia began hunting other women's children, killing them in revenge for her own losses. She was described as having the ability to remove her eyes, and as being particularly dangerous to pregnant women and newborn babies. The parallels with Lilith are unmistakable. Both were beautiful women who lost their children and became child-killing demons in revenge. Both specialized in attacking pregnant women and babies. Both were driven by grief and rage over their own losses. But Lamia also had her own distinctive characteristics. Where Lilith was associated with night and wind, Lamia was connected to water and caves. Where Lilith could appear as any woman, Lamia was often described as having a serpentine lower body, making her monstrous appearance more obvious. The Greek tradition also developed the figure of Gelo or Gillo, a female demon, who was said to have died young and childless, and who returned as a vengeful spirit to attack other women's children. Like Lilith, Gelo was particularly dangerous during the vulnerable period after childbirth, and like Lilith, she could be controlled through the use of protective amulets and incantations. Byzantine texts describe elaborate rituals for protecting against Gelo that are remarkably similar to the anti-Lilith practices we've discussed. The Roman tradition contributed the figure of Strix, originally a type of owl but later understood as a shape-shifting demon who could appear as either a bird or a woman. Strix was said to attack babies in their cribs, either killing them outright or draining their blood and life force. The Roman poet Ovid describes Strix as having hooked talons and a pallid face, and as being particularly active during the night when parents were asleep and unable to protect their children. Moving beyond the classical world, we find similar figures in cultures that had no direct contact with Jewish or Greco-Roman traditions. The Arabian tradition of the Qarina describes a female demon who forms spiritual marriages with men, visiting them in their dreams and bearing them demon children. Like Lilith, the Qarana is jealous of human women and will attack the wives and children of the men she claims as her own. Like Lilith, she can be controlled through the use of protective amulets and the invocation of divine names. The Mesopotamian tradition, which we discussed earlier as one of the sources for Lilith herself, also included other female demons with similar characteristics. Lamashtu, who we mentioned briefly before, was perhaps the most feared of these. She was described as having the head of a lion, the teeth of a donkey, and the talons of a bird, and she specialized in attacking pregnant women and stealing babies. But unlike Lilith, who was often portrayed as beautiful and seductive, Lamashtu was consistently described as monstrous and terrifying. What's particularly interesting about Lamashtu is how she was understood to operate. She wasn't just a random force of destruction. She was described as having specific methods and preferences. She would sneak into houses through windows or cracks in walls, She preferred to attack during the 7th month of pregnancy, or the first few days after birth, and she could be driven away through the use of specific protective rituals and amulets. These detailed descriptions suggest that Lamashtu, like Lilith, was understood as a real and present danger that required practical countermeasures. The Slavic tradition developed the figure of Rusalka, water spirits who were said to be the souls of women who had died by drowning, often as a result of suicide or murder. Rusalki were described as beautiful women with long green hair who would seduce men and drag them into rivers and lakes to drown. But they were also said to attack pregnant women and steal babies, particularly during the week after Pentecost, when they were most active on land. The Celtic tradition included the Banshee, a female spirit whose wailing was said to predict death, and the Leananside, a fairy woman who would form relationships with human men, inspiring them to great artistic achievements, but ultimately draining their life force and driving them to madness or death. While these figures weren't specifically focused on attacking children like Lilith, they shared the characteristic of being beautiful, dangerous women who used their sexuality to destroy men. Even cultures that were geographically and temporally distant from the ancient Near East developed similar figures. The Hindu tradition includes the Churil, the spirit of a woman who died in childbirth and who returns to attack other pregnant women and steal their babies. The Churil is described as appearing as a beautiful woman from the front, but having backwards feet and a hideous appearance from behind, making her a shape-shifting predator similar to Lilith. The Chinese tradition developed the figure of the Jiangshi, though these were more commonly male, and the Nue, a chimeric creature that could take female form, and was associated with bringing misfortune to families. Japanese folklore includes the Yuki Onna, a snow woman who would seduce and kill travelers, and the Onryo, vengeful female spirits who would attack the living out of rage and jealousy. What's remarkable about all of these traditions is how they share certain core characteristics, despite developing independently in different cultures and time periods. Almost all of these female demons are associated with death in childbirth or the loss of children. Almost all of them use their beauty and sexuality as weapons. Almost all of them specifically target pregnant women and babies. And almost all of them can be controlled or driven away through the use of protective rituals and amulets. This universality suggests that these demon traditions aren't just random cultural artifacts, but responses to universal human experiences and anxieties. The fear of losing a child, the danger of childbirth, the power and danger of female sexuality, the grief of women who die young or childless. These are concerns that transcend any particular culture or historical period. The specific details of how these fears are expressed vary from culture to culture, but the underlying anxieties remain remarkably consistent. The parallel traditions also help us understand what made Lilith unique and why her story became so elaborate and influential. While many cultures developed child-killing female demons, few gave them the psychological complexity and narrative sophistication that Jewish tradition gave to Lilith. Her story as Adam's first wife provided a framework for understanding not just what she did, but why she did it. Not just how to protect against her, but how to understand her motivations. The parallel traditions also show how these demon beliefs served important social and psychological functions. They provided explanations for inexplicable tragedies. They gave communities ways to fight back against forces they couldn't control. They expressed anxieties about female power and sexuality in culturally acceptable ways. And they created frameworks for understanding the relationship between individual behavior and cosmic forces. But perhaps most importantly, the parallel traditions remind us that Lilith wasn't just a unique Jewish creation, but part of a universal human attempt to understand and cope with some of the most fundamental challenges of human existence. The woman who said no to Adam was part of a vast sisterhood of women who had said no to the limitations that society tried to place on them, who had chosen power over submission, who had become dangerous precisely because they refused to accept the roles that had been assigned to them. As we conclude our exploration of Lilith's evolution, These parallel traditions remind us that her story resonates across cultures and centuries because it addresses fears and anxieties that are deeply embedded in human psychology. She represents the dark side of female power, the danger of uncontrolled sexuality, the grief of mothers who lose their children, and the rage of women who are denied equality and respect. These are not ancient concerns that have disappeared in the modern world. They are ongoing human realities that continue to shape our understanding of gender, power, and family relationships. The sister demons of Lilith show us that she was never alone in her rebellion against the established order. She was part of a vast network of female figures who refused to accept subordination, who chose freedom over security, who became dangerous precisely because they would not be controlled. And in their stories, we can see reflections of ongoing struggles for gender equality, sexual autonomy, and the right of women to define their own roles and destinies. As we reach the end of our journey through 4,000 years of Lilith's evolution, it's time to step back and see the complete picture of one of the most remarkable transformations in the history of mythology. What began as whispered fears about wind demons in ancient Mesopotamian cities has become a complex, multifaceted figure who embodies some of humanity's deepest anxieties about sexuality, power, equality, and rebellion. The story we've traced isn't just about the development of a single mythological character. It's about how human cultures create meaning, how they process trauma and fear, and how they use storytelling to understand the most challenging aspects of human existence. Let's trace this evolution one final time, but now with the full perspective of everything we've learned. In the beginning, around 2000 BCE in the cities of ancient Mesopotamia, there were no individual demons named Lilith. Instead, there were categories of spirits called Lilu, Lilitu, and Ardat Lili, wind demons who attacked people in their sleep, caused diseases, and threatened pregnant women and babies. These weren't personal entities with individual stories. They were types of supernatural threats that people needed to protect against through rituals, incantations, and protective magic. These early Mesopotamian demons already contained many of the elements that would later characterize Lilith. They were associated with night and wind, they attacked people sexually, they threatened reproduction and family life, and they could be controlled through the proper use of divine names and protective rituals. But they were still relatively simple supernatural threats, more like natural disasters than complex personalities with motivations and histories. The first major transformation occurred when these Mesopotamian demon traditions encountered Jewish monotheism during the Babylonian exile in the 6th century BCE. The prophet Isaiah's single mention of Lilith in his vision of Edom's desolation represents a crucial turning point. By including her name in his prophecy, Isaiah transformed Lilith from a general category of demon into a specific individual entity. More importantly, he placed her within a monotheistic framework where even demons served God's purposes, even if they did so as instruments of judgment and punishment. This biblical mention, brief as it was, gave Lilith a legitimacy and permanence that she wouldn't have had as merely a figure of folk belief. Once she was mentioned in Scripture, she became part of the official tradition that would be studied, interpreted, and elaborated by generations of Jewish scholars. The single word Lilith in Isaiah 34:14 became a seed crystal around which centuries of tradition would form. The Second Temple period, roughly 500 BCE to 70 CE, saw the next major development in Lilith's evolution. During this time, she multiplied from a single demon into a category of demons, the Lilan, who appeared in texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls as a recognized class of evil spirits that needed to be fought through prayer and ritual. This multiplication suggests that by this period, Lilith had become so well known and feared that her name had become a generic term for female night demons. The Talmudic period, from roughly 200 to 500 CE, marked another crucial transformation. The rabbis who compiled the Talmud treated Lilith as a known quantity, mentioning her casually in discussions of practical religious law and everyday life. They warned that she attacked men who slept alone, They described her physical appearance, and they connected her to the sexual dangers that threatened proper family life. Most importantly, they began to connect her to Adam himself, suggesting that during his separation from Eve, he had fathered demon children with spirits like Lilith. This Talmudic period also saw the development of the first systematic protective measures against Lilith, including the three angels Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Samanjalof, who would become central to all later Lilith traditions. The incantation bowls from this period show us how ordinary families dealt with their fear of Lilith through practical magic that combined sophisticated theology with folk wisdom. The medieval period, from roughly 800 to 1500 CE, witnessed the most dramatic transformation in Lilith's story. The alphabet of Ben Sira, written sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries, provided the first complete narrative of Lilith as Adam's first wife. This story didn't just explain who Lilith was, it explained why she had become humanity's enemy, giving her psychological depth and moral complexity that transformed her from a simple threat into a tragic figure. The medieval period also saw Lilith's elevation from an individual demon to a cosmic principle. The early Kabbalistic texts of the 12th and 13th centuries made her the feminine aspect of the Sitra Achra, the dark side of creation itself. She became not just Adam's rebellious first wife, but the queen of all demons, the bride of Samael, and a fundamental force in the cosmic struggle between good and evil. The Zohar, the great masterwork of Jewish mysticism written in 13th century Spain, gave Lilith her most complete and terrifying form. In the Zoharic system, she wasn't just a threat to individual families. She was a cosmic force that threatened the very foundations of creation. She was the dark mirror of the divine feminine, the force that sought to prevent cosmic redemption, the eternal no that opposed God's yes to creation. The late medieval and early modern periods, from roughly 1400 to 1700, saw the synthesis and systematization of all these various Lilith traditions. Texts like the Midrash Talpiot, the Yalkut Reubeni, and the Imek HaMelech brought together centuries of scattered traditions into comprehensive mythologies that attempted to answer every possible question about Lilith's nature, activities, and ultimate fate. During this same period, the amulet tradition reached its full development, with Jewish communities across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East using elaborate protective rituals to defend against Lilith's attacks. These weren't just theoretical beliefs. They were practical responses to real fears that shaped how people lived their daily lives, how they approached sexuality and family relationships, and how they understood the cosmic forces that influenced human destiny. Throughout this entire evolution, certain core elements remained remarkably consistent. Lilith was always associated with night and darkness. She always threatened pregnant women and babies. She always used her sexuality as a weapon, and she could always be controlled through the proper use of divine names and protective rituals. But the framework for understanding these characteristics changed dramatically over time. What began as simple fear of supernatural attack evolved into complex theological speculation about the nature of evil, the role of sexuality in cosmic order, and the relationship between individual behavior and universal harmony. Lilith became a lens through which Jewish communities understood fundamental questions about gender relations, sexual morality, family structure, and the problem of evil in a world created by a good God. The evolution of Lilith also reflects broader changes in Jewish culture and society over these 4 millennia. The early Mesopotamian demons reflected the concerns of agricultural societies vulnerable to natural disasters and disease. The biblical mention reflected the concerns of a people in exile, trying to maintain their identity while living under foreign rule. The Talmudic discussions reflected the concerns of communities trying to establish stable family structures and religious practices in a diaspora setting. The medieval elaborations reflected the concerns of communities that were simultaneously experiencing intellectual flowering and social persecution, developing sophisticated theological systems while living under constant threat. The mystical traditions reflected the concerns of communities that were trying to understand their place in a cosmic order that often seemed hostile to their survival and flourishing. But Lilith's evolution also reveals something important about how mythological figures develop and change over time. She wasn't created by a single author or in a single historical moment. Instead, she emerged gradually through the collective imagination of countless communities over thousands of years. Each generation added new elements to her story, responding to their own concerns and anxieties while building on the foundation laid by previous generations. This collective creation process helps explain why Lilith became such a powerful and enduring figure. She wasn't just one person's fantasy or fear. She was the crystallization of concerns that were shared across cultures and centuries. The fears she represented, the anxieties she embodied, the questions she raised about power, sexuality, and rebellion were universal human concerns that transcended any particular historical moment or cultural context. The parallel traditions we examined in our previous section confirmed this universality. The fact that similar figures appeared independently in cultures across the world suggests that Lilith represents something fundamental about human psychology and social organization. She embodies the fear of female power that exists outside of patriarchal control, the anxiety about sexuality that serves its own purposes rather than those of family and society, and the terror of women who choose autonomy over security. But Lilith also represents something more positive and inspiring. She embodies the refusal to accept unjust subordination, the courage to choose freedom over comfort, and the determination to maintain one's dignity even at enormous personal cost. Her story can be read as a tragedy about a woman who was wronged and who sought revenge, but it can also be read as an inspiring tale about someone who refused to compromise her principles even when faced with cosmic punishment. This dual nature, this ability to be simultaneously terrifying and inspiring, destructive and liberating, is what has made Lilith such an enduring figure. She speaks to different aspects of human experience and can be interpreted in multiple ways depending on the reader's perspective and concerns. She can be a cautionary tale about the dangers of female rebellion, or an inspiring story about the courage to resist oppression. As we conclude our exploration of Lilith's evolution, it's worth considering what her story tells us about the power of mythology itself. Mythological figures like Lilith aren't just entertainment or primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. They're sophisticated tools for processing complex psychological and social realities, for exploring difficult questions about human nature and social organization, and for creating meaning in the face of suffering and uncertainty. Lilith's 4,000-year journey from wind demon to cosmic queen shows us how human cultures use storytelling to understand themselves and their world. Her evolution reflects changing concerns about gender, sexuality, family, and power, but it also reveals enduring human struggles with questions of justice, equality, autonomy, and the price of rebellion. The woman who said no to Adam has become a permanent part of human consciousness, not just in Jewish culture, but in the broader cultural imagination. Her influence can be seen in literature, art, psychology, and feminist thought. She has become a symbol for anyone who has ever felt the tension between conformity and authenticity, between security and freedom, between acceptance and rebellion. But perhaps most importantly, Lilith's story reminds us that the questions she raises are still with us. The tension between equality and hierarchy in relationships, the challenge of balancing individual autonomy with social responsibility, the ongoing struggle for gender equality and sexual freedom, these are not ancient issues that have been resolved. They are contemporary challenges that every generation must face anew. In tracing Lilith's evolution from ancient Mesopotamian wind demon to medieval cosmic queen, we've seen how human cultures create meaning, how they process fear and anxiety, and how they use mythology to explore the most challenging aspects of human existence. We've seen how a simple supernatural threat can evolve into a complex theological principle, how folk beliefs can become sophisticated philosophical systems, and how individual stories can become universal symbols. The complete evolution of Lilith shows us that mythology is not a relic of the past, but a living, breathing aspect of human culture that continues to shape how we understand ourselves and our world. The ancient fears and anxieties that gave birth to Lilith are still with us, and her story continues to provide a framework for understanding and processing those concerns. From spirit to queen, from wind demon to cosmic force, from simple threat to complex symbol, Lilith's journey through 4 millennia of human imagination reveals the power of storytelling to create meaning, the persistence of fundamental human concerns across cultures and centuries, and the enduring relevance of ancient wisdom for contemporary challenges. The woman who refused to lie beneath Adam has become a permanent part of how humanity understands the eternal struggle between submission and rebellion, between security and freedom, between the way things are and the way they might be. Her evolution is complete, but her story continues. As long as humans struggle with questions of power, equality, sexuality, and autonomy, Lilith will remain relevant. As long as people face the choice between conformity and authenticity, between acceptance and rebellion, her example will continue to inspire and terrify. The first woman who said no has become the eternal symbol of the right to say no, and that is perhaps the most important lesson of her 4,000-year journey through human consciousness.